Welcome to the Jamal Thomas Morning Show. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is indeed my show. As I often say, this is our show. I can't necessarily have this show without you. I suppose I could do a show where I'm screaming in the void, but that wouldn't necessarily be the same show, and I'm not even sure if that would be all that much interesting to watch. Just my ego diminishing at each particular show, even though there was a point where I did that. I mean, keep in mind, I wasn't like many of the other people who were doing either YouTube or some of these other videos. I started with zero, just me, maybe my mama looking at me do the show. In the beginning, I don't even think it was my mama because nobody believed there was going to be anything. I just kept doing it because A, I enjoyed it, and B, real men needed to do the news. We needed news. Hence, I did the news. But no, you guys supported me in this. And it's been, around 10 years at this point? Jesus, I'm getting old. And I appreciate you guys for supporting me because many of you are still here after all of this time. Whether it was the radio station, whether it was me doing the show, whether it was me coming back to do the show, whether it was me create this new iteration of the Jamal Thomas Morning Show, many of you have been here the entire way through. And I thank you for it. We have a damn good show for you today, a full show for you today, especially leading into Christmas and then into a new year. We're going to have Mark Sloboda. There's right much news that have been taking place. In Russia, there was an attack on a residential building by these kind of waves of drones hitting the building in Kazan. And to be clear, no military target, no military utility in the context of the target. It was just out of spite. Maybe something could be said just because it was Kazan and they had the BRICS summit at Kazan, but short of that, it was just spite. Now, to be fair, and well, fair otherwise, I suppose, you had the situation where Ukraine was attacking non-military targets anyway, even in the Donbass. That was one of the things that provoked the conflict in the first place. So there is that. Daniel Lazar, he is going to be here. We're also going to have Michael Maloof. And there was one more. Oh, Malik. Malik said he was going to be back. And so he is going to be back today. There is a lot of news. A lot of news. One of the big stories has to do with the Christmas massacre, I'm going to call it, in Germany, where a Saudi man drives his car into a Christmas market. So in Europe, I don't necessarily think they have them in the States, but in Europe, the various European states have Christmas markets. They're awesome, typically awesome to go to. But in this case, the Saudi man literally drives through, killing, I believe, 4 and injuring 200. Saudi Arabia had asked for this guy back multiple times, but for whatever reason, Germany didn't give him back, believing that he was going to be executed if he got sent back to Saudi Arabia. I suppose in retrospect, maybe they should have sent him back. On top of that, the ADP, they are leading in the polling going into the next election. And I would imagine this is going to hurt the Schultz government in that election because they're going to make the argument, well, we would have kicked the guy out. We would have gone back to Saudi Arabia and these people would have still been alive. I strongly suspect that is the argument that they're going to make. Either way, that has taken place. Putin has vowed retaliation, of course, for the strike in Kazan. But again, he's vowed retaliation for one strike after the next. So there's that. Pragmatism is a good thing. By the same token, you can imagine that people will get fed up with pragmatism after a while. In the other thing, a U.S., and by the way, here is, just so you can see it for yourself, this is the attack that took place. Let me know if you guys can hear this, by the way. I want to make sure the volume is working correctly. Yeah, residential building, non-military target, drone slams into it. And honestly, it gives this feeling of 9/11. It gives this feeling of 9/11. It's just weird, to put it mildly. The other issue, Yemen. So a vicious attack on Yemen. And I guess there are two parts to this. In the first one, the Houthis have continued their strikes in the Red Sea and continued their strikes against Tel Aviv. So you get this attack that took place against Tel Aviv. It is astonishing to me that a country that was in literal starvation at one point, just a few years ago, is now firing missiles that are going hypersonic speeds that are traveling all the way to Israel and hitting with a certain degree of precision. That's just astonishing. And they're doing this despite the fact that the other Arab states are just standing there with their thumb in their ass, watching all of these people being slaughtered. That is amazing. There was a response to that. In response, you had attacks by the UK and the United States attacking Yemen. So there is that. Now, in addition to these attacks that were taking place, apparently there was a missile. Okay, apparently there were bombing raids that were taking place. The Houthis responded to those bombing raids by launching attacks against the ships. I believe it was the Harry Truman, and there was one more that was out there. There might have been more than one more, but there were two that were involved in this particular incident. The U.S. ends up losing a fighter jet, F-18. Now, the Houthis came out and say, we shot it down. They say, we shot it down. Now, the U.S. pointed out, no, the Houthis didn't shoot down our plane. This was a friendly fire incident. And to be clear, the U.S. is probably right on this. The reason why I say that is the Houthis were launching against the ship. So they sent drones and they sent missiles at the ship. Now, what it sounds like, at the very least, and I'm going to have Mike Maloof to kind of talk about this. He's a defense guy. He would know it better than I would. But what it sounds like is that as the drones or as the missiles were coming in, there was some level of confusion and they end up shooting the plane. Now, the thing that the people asked was, well, wait a minute, how did they shoot down their own plane? I mean, shouldn't a missile system be able to identify friend versus foe? Well, if it's a missile system, yes, but if it's the guns and the guns were shooting down drones, then maybe not. I don't know. Again, this is going to be a conversation for Michael Maloof, but all things being equal, the U.S. ends up losing a fighter jet. And on top of losing that fighter jet, you got the situation where the two pilots jumped out. So the pilots were safe, but the jet was lost. There was also footage that came out showing some level of damage to one of the ships for the U.S., but I don't necessarily know if that's legit. That could have been doctored. And for that matter, it could have been a photo of something else that had taken place that was substituted. Social media is such. And I tend to be somewhat doubtful of pretty much anything in social media without some level of attribution that I can verify to it. So there is that story. Also, Romania. If you remember, Georgescu, I believe is his name, wins the first round, comes out of nowhere, wins the first round in the in the Romanian election. Then you get accusations, an intelligence report that said that the Russians were involved in TikTok operations against the other candidates and ideally against the Ukrainian government in order to help the Russian-backed, as they called him, candidate Georgescu. So there was an investigation into those claims. And what ended up being the case is that it wasn't the Russians. It ended up actually being Romania itself. Romania itself. So, wildly enough, a Romanian organization in Romania, I'm trying to find the exact name of it. There it is. Okay. So, an organization called the National Liberation Party. I just read it. The Ceausescu campaign was not funded by the Russians, but in fact, the pro-Western National Liberation Party. The media outlet Snoop has reported, citing the probe's finding, Ceausescu has filed a case against the Supreme Court to challenge the annulment. So apparently, they had this, I guess, not policy, but I guess it was a drive in order to get people to vote. And the only thing that the policy push out to influencers and TikTok and everything else was vote for a responsible candidate. And it was something else. They took that to mean Ceausescu, because if you say, hey, do you want a war? Do you want your people to go die? Do you want to function to whatever is in the best interest of Romania as opposed to what is in the best interest of, let's say, NATO? Well, and those people, many of them, social influencers, pick Ceausescu. It wasn't the Russians. It was nothing like that. It ended up being the Romanian government itself. So think about it for the moment. Ceausescu ends up winning the first round, comes out the blue to do so. The court, in the middle of the second round, annuls the election and kills the election. So they killed it under false pretenses, preventing this guy from winning the race, the one who was, let's say, skeptical of NATO involvement, or at the very least skeptical of close work with NATO, specifically the military base that they wanted to put on the soil in Romania. Just astonishing. Just astonishing. Now, this channel pointed out right off the bat, that sounds like nonsense. And the reason why I said it sounds like nonsense, not because I have any crystal ball or any kind of magical capability per se. I don't have foresight. I don't remote view all that well. No, it was previous history. If you remember, they did the same thing in the United States. They tried to do the same thing in Georgia, where they would say, the Russians did it. That's why they won. Trump won because of the Russians. Okay, it was nonsense here. And if it was nonsense here, and they spent 3 years pushing that nonsense on the American public, just a mass psyop, then yeah, my first instinct, short of them proving it in some way, I'm going to think it's bogus. Just like in Georgia, that woman, Sobersvili. No, is that right? Sobersvili. I'll check her name in a moment. Salome Zorbasvili, that's it. Who claim the Russians were involved. And even though I can't prove it, I just know it. We just feel it. Like America can't even prove it, but we just feel it. This is the nonsense that they were coming out with. So yeah, I'm going to be a bit skeptical and I'm going to be a bit jaded when I'm covering those type of stories, unless there's something in order for me to pin it on to. So I will give that. Yeah, man, there's several things that happened over the course of the weekend. Even al-Jolani. So al-Jolani is the king jihadist that overthrew the government of Syria. Al-Jolani comes out and says that he is going to disarm all of the other militant groups in Syria. Now, again, that's pretty astonishing. If you think of it, HTS is composed of all of these other disparate factions. And among these disparate factions, you have Uyghurs, you have, groups from all over the Middle East that were effectively paid to go there and do exactly what they did, which is overthrow the government of Syria. All right. Now, he has to know that this is a fragile thing. I mean, all things being equal, there are multiple groups. Each group is going to have different concerns and different things that they want. They may even have different goals or objectives, or even a certain difference in belief sets, or even in levels of tolerance. He knows this is an issue. He can see what happened in Libya. He can see what happened in Iraq. And he's like, yes, We are going to disarm all of the groups in Syria. All of the factions, all of the weapons are going to go under the auspices of the government of Syria. Now, he said this while meeting with the foreign minister of Turkey. Also, he changed his name to Ahmed al-Shahara. Well, Ahmed al-Shahara. Now, what's wild about this is this also includes the Kurds. So if it indeed includes the Kurds, then the catch becomes, okay, well, the US ostensibly backs the Kurds. And if this is going to include the Kurds, well, it seems like they are going to be on a collision course with one another. All right. The US military came out and for whatever reason does not know how many people they have in the theater of Syria. No, seriously. They don't know. So this was a briefing where the military commander in the US comes out and says, so we've been giving you a heads up on how many people we have in Syria, but, we got it wrong. Apparently, there are twice as many in Syria than we actually knew, which is a level of incompetence that is kind of hard to wrap my head around. But incompetence nonetheless. Here we are. We have our main man here, the one and only Mark Sloboda. Mark Sloboda is an international relations and security analyst, easily one of my favorite people to talk to and the person I go to when I need context of what's taking place abroad. How you doing, Mark? You doing all right this morning?
Jamaro, I'm alive. How are you? Thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
I am also alive, a bit dragging ass this morning, but I'm alive nonetheless. No, man, thank you for joining me, especially getting close to Christmas like this, the holidays. I guess the first thing to bring up.
Christmas in January, Jamaro.
Christmas in January. Well, right, for there. Fair enough. It's like the real Christmas is in January.
Orthodox Christmas.
It's like, it's not soccer, it's football. But no, I wanted to go into the attack on the building in Kazan. This random didn't seem to apply to anything. This was once again another attack on a civilian building that didn't necessarily have any military significance to it at all. Or did it have military significance? I was showing the audience on the video, this is what it looked like. I mean, there was nobody killed, so maybe it looked worse than what it was, but it still looks pretty bad. This is it hitting the building, looks like an airplane, and honestly, it even looks like 9/11 to me, and to other Americans who was looking at that. What went on with that? Was there any significance to that target at all?
Okay, so the Kiev regime made 2 attacks in the beginning of the weekend, Friday, Saturday, and they are both largely seen as revenge attacks. Okay, there is not any apparent evidence that they were at hard targets, certainly not at Kazan. The second attack was at a town, a small town in the Kursk region by the name of Rilsk. This was a town that the Kiev regime had obviously intended to reach on their route to the Zaporozhye to the Kursk nuclear power plant, if that was indeed, as presumed, the original goal of their incursion, a failed attempt to reach the Kursk nuclear power plant when they launched that incursion several months ago. Now, in Rilsk, several buildings, colleges, a cultural center, and other things were hit. Now, there is the possibility that in Rilsk, that Russian troops may have been billeted in some of those buildings, okay? Because the front lines are not far from there, and it is absolutely routine for both sides to use any big, building of serious construction, schools, colleges, hospitals, right? Both sides use them for troop placements, and that's simply a fact of this type of heavy land-centric warfare. So I have not seen any evidence that troops, but I'm willing to at least consider. If so, they hit it again because it was a soft target. This was done with HIMARS, U.S.-made HIMARS missiles. Now, again, if they made this attack, it won't really, even if there were Russian troops inside, not going to have any serious effect on the battlefield. It's more about the psychological impact, right, of escalation and the idea of terror, right? So again, I cannot confirm or deny whether any Russian troops were actually there. The Russian media is presenting it as if not. It's every possibility that there weren't. I'm simply considering the possibility that maybe there were. Now, Kazan is a different story. Kazan is it is in, southern Russia, south east of Moscow. It is the capital of the Russian region of Tatarstan, which the Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, these are Tatar ethnic regions. They have, a degree of autonomy and strong politics and culture in that area. Most recently, the BRICS summit, hosted by Russia just over a month ago, was held in Kazan. It is an important multi-ethnic and multi-confessional center for Russia. It is kind of a showcase city of how Russia's different religions can cohabit peacefully. Even Hillary Clinton, in an almost seemingly another life years ago, said of Kazan, it's an example of how Christians and Muslims can live peacefully together, right? These are Sufi Islam, the dominant there. And within the Kremlin of Kazan, Kremlin is simply a word that means like fortress, right? And most Russian cities have a historical Kremlin, right, at their heart, as a remnant of the history of the Russian ancient history. And in the Kremlin in Kazan, there is an Orthodox cathedral facing a Sufi mosque directly across from each other. So it's important in that respect. So now in Kazan, as far as I can tell, Kazan was hit by drones.
Right.
Now these drones were supposedly long-range drones, but even the Kiev regime's claims that it used long-range drones. This is more than 1,000 kilometers from the nearest Kiev regime-held territory in Ukraine, which puts it, well, just beyond the absolute maximum extent possible of these drones. And when they're carrying explosives, that would make it even more difficult. They traversed all of this territory without triggering any of Russia's air defense radars of the like, if we are to believe that they came all the way from Ukraine. Now, a lot of Russian military experts don't believe that these drones came from Ukraine, that they were launched probably by SBU teams, Ukrainian intelligence, either from within Russia itself or from within neighboring Kazakhstan, something that would have occurred almost certainly without knowledge of the Kazakh government. But Kazakh is a big empty country too. There's lots of territory, and the SBU has shown ability, I believe, in several previous attacks to conduct drone attacks out of third countries. One, for an element of surprise and avoiding existing air defense and radar and electronic warfare coverage, and two, probably an attempt to further horizontally escalate the conflict to potentially drag in more. Earlier this year, we saw a Ukrainian drone attack in Murmansk, right? Absolute northwestern Russia. And if you remember, we talked about it at the time, and I said I was pretty sure that the attack came from Finland. The question being whether the Finnish government knew the attacks were made out of their territory or not. We have also seen several drone attacks that almost certainly came out of the Baltics as well. So I believe that this is most likely. These attacks cannot occur at large scale, something that would represent any type of strategic threat against Russia, right? But they can surprise, they can grab headlines. Potentially, they could strike some sensitive targets. But in this case, in Kazan, doesn't appear to be the case. Now, Kazan does have a lot of potential military targets, particularly military industrial targets, right? Except for one of the drones, which we're told hit an industrial facility. And I can't verify that, whether that was a military industrial facility or a civilian industrial facility. But the rest of the drones were clearly targeted at residential buildings, including the building that we saw on your video there. That is the Azure Sky building, which is it's a residential building. It is the tallest building in Kazan. In the Kazan skyline, it's some 23 stories. Again, a lot of Russian cities go out rather than up. And there were several other tall buildings, residential buildings, also targeted. Now, this seems clear to be part of an information warfare and, a terror attack. It is meant to instill, right? We heard this from the New York Times already talking about it a year ago when attacks were being conducted at skyscrapers, again, business center buildings in Moscow. And the New York Times spoke fairly approvingly about what they called the need to bring the war home to the Russian people. That is applauding attacks, meant to instill terror on Russian civilians, right? That is exactly what the New York Times did. They simply tried to couch it in more, obfuscating language. And this is the same thing, again, that definitely happened in Kazan. And we've seen it also in Belgorod many times before. Specifically targeting residential buildings. Now, for the one building that was hit, that was an industrial facility, that's a legitimate target, right? The Russian government playing the same political game at times that the Kiev regime does or the U.S. does when its military facilities might call that terrorism. I would not call that terrorism. Both sides of this conflict are attacking each other's industrial facilities, whether they're directly industrial or not, right? I may not like that it was hit, but it was a legitimate target. Residential buildings that were clearly targeted, not a mistake of a missile going awry due to the effects of air defense or electronic warfare, which has happened multiple times, many times on the Kiev regime side, has happened occasionally on the Russian side as well. This is not the case. They were deliberately targeting tall civilian residential buildings with exactly what you talked about. It speaks to the image of the World Trade Center being hit. That is, they're aiming for a psychological, a terror impact. And that makes these particular attacks absolutely unjustified and a clear act of terror beyond any conception of the norms or rules of war. The attacks on Rilsk, I don't have enough information. There may have been some legitimate targets there if Russian troops were billeted. Again, not a significant amount of damage done anyway, if that was the intent there. Or it may have also been just a civilian terror attack. I don't have enough images. But when both of them occur back to back like this, then of course questions have to be asked. Was the attack in Rilsk similar, right? Meant out of an attempt for political terror. And this is the same thing that in all intents and purposes, the assassination using terrorist methods
That's right.
of the Russian Lieutenant General Kirillov, the head of Russia's CBRN defense forces. Again, that was meant to instill terror. Right, that was meant to take a high-ranking general, not directly involved in any particular way in the conflict, but just to be able to reach out and hit. And so, terror attacks, bombings, drone attacks on civilian buildings, as the Kiev regime gets more and more desperate, as their forces continue to crumble on the battlefield before a Russian steamroller, particularly in the South Donbass, but also increasingly in the Kursk region and elsewhere, Kupiansk area, another big one right now. They're going to do more and more of this, right? Because that's what they can do, and they are committed to a policy of total, Gotterdammerung war of annihilation, signaling that this is another signal that they have no intentions of any type of, negotiated settlement, surrender, nothing like that. They will fight to the bitter end. And as they do so, they will increasingly turn to such, you want to call it dirty warfare, if you want to call it, as the U.S. military would, unconventional warfare, whatever. You want to use. But when you're attacking civilian buildings for the psychological impact, that's a terror attack.
Yes, just a terror attack.
That's just a terror attack, right? And there have been other attacks that the Russian government has called a terror attack before, and I said, no, it's not a terror attack. That was you hit a refinery, okay, right? You don't want a refinery blowing up, but that's not a terror attack, right? Hitting a civilian residential building entirely against the rules and norms of war, and not a mistake, quite obviously, right? So, again, unfortunately, we can expect more and more of this until the regime is completely not only wiped out of Kiev, but probably out of the entire country, which means we could see more of this for years into the future.
I hope not. El País apparently pointed out that Donald Trump sent a message to Zelensky saying, hey, maybe you should consider a ceasefire, and you should also consider ceding the territory that Russia has already liberated.
Which is still completely missing the point.
Right, exactly. I don't think he fully gets it, right?
No one does. No one wants to get it in the West. Right?
Yeah.
They want Russia's demands to be other than they are, because that is a blow to the geopolitical prestige of the US-led Western global hegemony. When it's about NATO, not about the territory. The territory is secondary, almost incidental, as a result of everything else that has been going on. So that's clearly not going to be enough for the Russian government. Not, we won't bring the Kiev regime and Ukraine into NATO in the next few years, or we'll suspend, talks, and we'll visit in the future, and we'll pump them full of arms and troops and quote unquote peacekeepers in the meantime. Once we get a ceasefire in place, no, yet, none of that, none, no, not NATO, not de facto NATO, not even a little NATO, not NATO weapons, no NATO. None out of Ukraine, and Russian special military operation will continue as long as it takes, whatever it takes, until we beat that through the heads of the regime in Kiev and in Brussels and in Washington.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because apparently Fico was in Moscow talking to Putin.
Yes.
And this European leader pointed out that Zelensky tried to bribe him with 500 euros in order to support his bid for NATO.
500 million.
Thank you. 500 million euros to support his bid for NATO. That's pretty astonishing. He's basically using our tax dollars to try to bribe a European leader to back his bid to NATO. That's pretty, Why was Fico in Moscow? What was the conversation about between Putin and
Yeah.
Fico about?
Okay, so just so everyone is on the same page, Robert Fico is the prime minister of
Right.
Slovakia, right? A country in Central Eastern Europe, right?
Mhm.
If you will. Now, Robert Fico is what is characterized in the Western press as a far left, right? Kind of the opposite book post to the far right. It's always far right. Victor Orban. In Fico's case, he's an old school leftist, right? I mean, he's what many people refer to as an unrepentant communist.
Mhm.
He is also a bit of a Slavophile, right? And that includes Russia as well. He is um, very intensely tries to remind everyone of the role that Russia, as you know, the constituent country of the Soviet Union, played in defeating Nazi Germany in World War II, including running over the fascist local forces in Slovakia that had allied themselves with Hitler. And so freeing Slovakia from those as well. Very similar to the Banderites in Ukraine, it must be said. He has, there was an assassination attempt on Fico much earlier this year, where he was shot, and the perpetrator was a, shall we say, radicalized pro-Ukrainian extremist in Slovakia who attempted to kill him primarily for his position on not supplying arms to the Kiev regime in Ukraine. He survived it. He was months in recovery. He is back. Slovakia's policies have not changed. In fact, despite the attempt to kill him over the issue, Robert Fico has only become more firm in his opposition to EU and NATO support for the Kiev regime in Ukraine. And his visit, he has previously indicated that he wanted to come to Moscow for the Victory Day parade to celebrate the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II, which is on May 9th in Russia. But he has suddenly shown up in Moscow this weekend. And the reason why is that the Kiev regime in Ukraine has indicated that it is not going to extend or renew gas supply contracts through the Druzhba pipeline from Russia into Central Europe that transit through Ukrainian territory. Now, all through this conflict, gas has flowed through the Druzhba pipeline. It has not been touched by sanctions. That was something that was always exempted from Western sanctions against Russia because of the important need to these countries' economies and an attempt to get them on board with the rest of the proxy war. It not only affects Slovakia, but also Hungary, to a lesser extent, Austria, Italy, and Serbia as well. And all of these countries are making noise that they want these contracts extended because, of course, they will have to fight for much more expensive gas with the rest of Europe, which will have severe effect on their economies, and probably isn't enough easily to go around, certainly not without putting the price through the roof. And they argue, why should we pay more for gas for your geopolitical games? The Kiev regime's leadership, including their prime minister Schmigel, over the last week, has indicated that no, absolutely not. They will not extend these contracts. And there has been very harsh words, foul words, foul language by Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials against Fico and some other of those Central East European leaders previously, but Orban as well, right? We've all heard that, but Fitzo definitely coming in, and so Fitzo was coming to Moscow primarily to discuss energy supplies, gas supplies. What I honestly don't know what can be done. If there could be some type of, if there's any possibility of extending Turk Stream to connect with Slovakia in a short period of time, I don't know if anything can be done there. But obviously, coming, not only was this the reason that was presented, but I think it's obviously a show of support for Russia in this conflict. Quite obviously, it is a big middle finger to Brussels, to the United States, right? To the Kiev regime in Ukraine. He's basically signaling, yeah, we're not with you on this. We're with Russia on this. And that's fair, right? I mean, some other leaders like Viktor Orban, I would not say is pro-Russian. He's pro-Hungarian, right? And he simply sees it in Hungary's a realist look at Russia's or at Hungary's national interests. This conflict is not in Hungary's national interest, right? It's not about that. Fitzo is another story. He is a Slavophile. He views Russia and Slovakia at some level as brother characters, and he has been popularly elected in Slovakia. And while there is still divided politics, clearly a majority of Slovak citizens seem to be on Fitzo's side on this, because not only has Fitzo's party dominated the parliament, but they also have the president elected as well. So they seem pretty, at this point, pretty firmly consolidated in Slovakia. And as much as there is a majority or a plurality of Slovak society, they seem behind his foreign policy stance, which makes them almost unique within the EU and NATO. But it also presents kind of a twin mirror image, far left, far right, of Viktor Orban for his own national regions in Hungary. So now it's quite obvious that the NATO EU split over the foreign policy course of this proxy war in Ukraine is deepening and becoming more public as Orban and Fitzo are more willing to more loudly protest against all of this. And now we have another NATO member state, EU member state leader defecting, right, from the foreign policy orthodoxy and flying to Moscow to have meetings and, of course, photo ops with the Russian president, which must, in Brussels, they must literally be pulling out whatever hair left they have on their heads.
I'm curious on something else. Putin was having an interview where he pointed out that Russia should have went in sooner. Basically, when he realized that the West wasn't necessarily going to do
which
anything.
Is what I said in 2014. But
yes, you did. And look, that was the criticism, right? It's like, is there anything that you would have did differently? Yeah, I would have initiated special military operations sooner. I'm curious on what they're saying in Moscow that pushes him into that point of view. Well, it probably is not even pushing him to point of view, but I would imagine there are hardliners that are in Moscow every bit as much as Putin is more of a moderate in this situation.
As much as I am a hardliner, yeah.
Please.
Yeah, there were lots of political voices, right? Patriotic voices, right? Generally, also pro-Putin voices within Russia politically, that from 2014, 2015, all the way up until 2022, were objecting to Putin's course of this frozen conflict and this attempt, certainly what Putin believed to settle the geopolitical and political crisis in Ukraine with the Minsk Accords, whose goal was to politically reconcile the east of Ukraine, the Donbass, with the putsch, the Westback putsch that occurred in Kiev in early 2014, right? To keep the Donbass as part of Ukraine, but, obviously you overthrew our government, right? Unconstitutionally, right? You waged war on us, right? The political terms of peace are not going to be the same. They wanted autonomy in the Donbass, right? That was what was being argued and so forth. And that was the Minsk Accords. But we now know that from the Kiev regime and the Western side, right? Because the Minsk Accords were guaranteed by France and Germany, that they did not view the Minsk Accords as anything that they were intending to follow through on. Both Merkel and Hollande and Macron, after him, have come forward and said that the Minsk Accords were never meant to be completed. They were always meant simply to buy time to build up a powerful NATO-armed, NATO-trained army for the Kiev regime in Ukraine, right? And there are lots of people who said at the time that the Minsk Accords were naive, that you certainly can't trust the Kiev regime in Ukraine, and you can't trust the West. And Putin has a long history of wanting to be integrated with the West, right? Respecting Russia's sovereignty and interests, but people now try to wipe out of history all the attempts Putin made since he first came to power, right? In around the year 2000, right? Already a quarter century ago. He was the first one to express regrets to George W. Bush after the 9/11 attacks and provide Russian assistance for not only the war on terror, but actually to provide direct assistance on the ground for the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. Something that's not discussed very often because Russia still had lots of contacts and interests on the ground in the forces that would then become, the Afghan government. They were among them. But also, Putin quietly pursued Boris Yeltsin's requests about joining NATO, and there was all of this, but there was none of that. NATO would expand. Russia would continue to be outside of that security arrangement and essentially the target of it, right? As has always been NATO's purposes. And Russia felt more and more uncomfortable as time goes on. But he was not anti-Western when he came to power. By far, something quite different. He has been fashioned by events and by the West's actions. And when we get to 2014, some of Putin's closest advisors, including Sergei Glaziev, someone who I follow very closely, was telling Putin, you need to get rid of this putsch regime now, right? In a few years, they will have a 250,000 strong army, right? Equipped by the West if you don't act now, right? And Putin didn't listen. And a few years later, they had a 250,000 strong army armed and backed by the West now. Putin is he is KGB, right? Or was KGB and FSB, but as part of that, he's also a lawyer. And he looks for legalistic, diplomatic solutions whenever he can. He is very cautious and restrained in the use of force, no matter what kind of image they try to present of him, in the Western media. He is cautious and pragmatic and calculating. Right, that those are the best way to describe him, and he has always been restrained in the use of force, including in the last few years of the special military operation. So that there continue to be voices of criticism of him. That's why this is not the first time he's remarked that he should have launched the intervention in Ukraine much earlier, but he has brought it up again, and he owns it. He says outright, "I was tricked and betrayed by Western leaders, including Angela Merkel," right? Whom evidently he placed for some reason, some degree of trust in on a personal level. So he feels very upset about that. And that, by the way, does not bode well for any future diplomatic settlement of this conflict, because everyone in Russia says, how can we ever trust anything they say, whether it's the Europeans, the regime in Kiev, from the January 21st agreement to the both Minsk agreements to the Istanbul communique, to previous things like the anti-ABM treaty and everything else. How can we, anything they sign, right? In the United States, they pull out of everything with the change of every president, right? Mm-hmm. Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal with Iran as soon as he came to power, right? With this, polarized U.S. politics. So the Russian perspective has got to be, we can only achieve peace and a quote unquote diplomatic settlement, but only when there are undeniable results on the battlefield that provide overwhelming strength to us, so that there's no wiggle room, right? There's no rebuilding later or something like that. But it's going to make any deal very hard to sign, because there is zero trust, right? Even if they gave in to Russia's terms, of which there is absolutely no sign, whether by the Kiev regime, by the majority of European leaders, or by Donald Trump and what his envoy team are talking about there. Nothing even approximates, come anywhere close to what Russia has continued to stand by as their bedrock, goals and demands of the special military operation. If they can achieve it politically, they'd be happy to, but they're not going to step back. And if they can't get it politically, then they will continue to achieve it militarily on the ground.
Well, it seems that Putin is still saying that he is going to retaliate. And I guess, well, let's go with that one first. Because,
sure.
Well, no, let's go with the other one first that I was thinking of. What does it mean for any kind of negotiation? Well, you said he can only get it through strength. So basically, all of this talk of negotiations is somewhat of a moot point. That means that they're going to complete the special military operation and go forward. I mean, this was a question I always had in the very beginning. I mean, we burnt our bridges in regards to any kind of peace deal. I mean, the Minsk agreements were blown off. Like you said, the JCPOA was blown off. They blew off the missile agreements. So it's like, how could they ever really come to any kind of terms in any kind of deal?
I don't have the slightest idea yet. I really don't. I always ask, what do you imagine a settlement of this looks like? And no one can tell me, right?
Yeah.
I think it looks like the frozen conflict in Syria, and you saw with no agreement how that turned out, right? The conflict was simply reignited at a time more preferable to, in this particular case, Turkey and the United States.
I can't believe that they would accept that terms, like, especially after seeing what just took place in Syria. They have to know that any opportunity to unfreeze that conflict at the worst moment for Russia would be the plan going forward.
Absolutely. I mean, they talk about it openly. I mean, it's not a hidden thing. They talk about that on the front pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post. We'll sign a ceasefire now and arm Ukraine to the teeth and retake that territory at a later time, right? That's push Ukraine drag Ukraine into NATO, right? In short order as soon as we get a ceasefire, or put NATO troops, EU member state troops, totally not NATO troops. They got a completely different hat on, on the ground, right? As soon as the ceasefire, which, Russia, from, the Russian perspective, okay, no ceasefire, right? I mean, that's there will be no ceasefire. There will be no time period to rearm, retrain, allow them to, as Putin has said, conscript more people like stray dogs in the streets, which is a pretty accurate description of their press gangs roaming the streets of Ukraine's cities and villages. But yeah, I don't see any hope for future deal. Now, the Russian government has always said, we'll talk, right? We have no conditions for talking with the West. If you want to sit down and talk, we'll listen. we're not going to change our demands or anything, but we'll always talk. Right. So I think that will happen. Right. If the political will in the Trump administration can actually be reached for Kellogg or someone else to come to Moscow, I'm sure Putin will meet with them. But that is not going to anyone who gets ridiculous expectations on their head that some kind of peace deal is going to be signed the next day or the next month or the next half a year. These terms that Russia are demanding are simply not acceptable to any U.S. president, even Donald Trump, because as I've been saying since Donald Trump was elected back in November, and other papers like now the Financial Times picked up over the weekend, that once Trump takes office, he owns that conflict. It is his now. He is the U.S. president. And if he simply, walked away from it and said, oh, I don't like Zelensky and I don't like the Kiev regime, they were politically against me in the U.S., Putin can have it. That's not going to happen. That can't happen because he is the U.S. president, right? And that is what all of the people that he has surrounded himself, including all of the neocons that he's surrounded himself will say, and then they'll say, the only way to end this conflict is through strength. And if Putin won't agree to our terms, then you need to escalate to de-escalate, right? I've said it since right after the election, and now they're talking about this openly, right? That these are the conversations occurring, within Trump's own people, supposedly part of his, his de-escalation team, right? If he doesn't call it that's what some people have projected onto it, right? So unfortunately, I don't do hope. I would hope that some sense is achieved, that Trump stays by his instincts on this, if that's what they are. I simply, through all the evidence in the past, not only from everything the U.S. has been involved in Ukraine, but also from our experience with the previous Trump administration, I don't have any hope. I don't do hope. I operate on facts, and I start always from the absolute worst assumption, with my opinion of human nature being what it is, and then I allow myself to be gradually walked back from that worst assumption by interpretation of facts and evidence. And that leads to a very depressing mentality in life, yes, but I find that it does me very well in analyzing the situation, in these events, unfortunately.
It tends to be more accurate. I mean, because the truth of the matter is, regardless of what Trump wants to do, how could you trust the very next president in 4 years? That's always going to be the issue.
Even if you believe Trump,
Right. Even if you take everything he's saying is true. One last question on this. What is going on internally to Moscow in regards to these terror attacks? Meaning, Putin has vowed retaliation. He keeps vowing retaliation. But it doesn't necessarily seem that the retaliation is doing... I mean, yeah, it's satisfying in one sense, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be a deterrent from these terror attacks.
Of course it won't be, right? I mean, escalation is part of the whole logic of these things. So they want a response, right?
That means you don't have revenge.
Yeah.
So what is he going to do? Because I would imagine the conversation in Moscow has to be pretty loud at this point.
Some of that has already happened.
Yeah.
So part of seemingly this attack and risk in Kazan was an immediate counterattack or revenge attack to Russia's revenge or counterattack, right? So in response to the terrorist assassination of the Russian Lieutenant General Kirillov, Russia at the end of last week launched missile attacks in Kiev. They targeted the head of the Ukrainian intelligence services, the SBU, which anonymously claimed credit for the assassination. Even in all the Western media reported that through their own sources. And there were numerous other targets, including Patriot system defense targets hit in Kiev. And very interestingly, the top floor of a building, very specifically, was hit And it is widely assumed that there were several important people, including generals, possibly. There are rumors, there are always rumors that Western generals were involved. I have no way of knowing that or not. We'll see if any generals have die of sudden death syndrome or hiking in the Alps or drowning or in their pools in the very near future. And that's the only way we'll find out about that, if indeed there were Western generals involved. So watch the obituaries over the next month or so. But for accidental deaths like that of high-ranking military people that can't be accounted for. But it seems that this was a gut response. So in a way, all right, Russia quite clearly had a very specific target intended. So the Kiev regime's response was to just go out and hit residential buildings, right? That was their thing. And this is going to happen until that regime is removed, right? And yes, there is a Russian demand to retaliate, but it's never going to be, or hopefully it won't be, the type of knee-jerk gut reaction, right? Where you want revenge, you want payback, right? I feel that myself, right? This is extremely unsatisfying at some level to see all of these attacks. But thank all the divine beings that I am not in charge of Russia, that it is Putin who is a much more pragmatic, cold-blooded, and calculating person than I or many other people, and pretty much all Americans would and be in this
situation.
There is a demand for action. There is a sentiment, but that is completely overwhelmed by the sense that we are winning and we are not going to be diverted by provocations. We will take action, but we are not going to be diverted into an unreasonable escalation of the conflict that could change the calculus diplomatically or on the battlefield. We will stay the course and continue doing what we're doing because we're winning. And that all of these, what Putin called it was Medvedev who called the agonies of the Bandera regime. And this is what it is. They're lashing out in agony because they're increasingly desperate and panicked. And this is what they're going to do. They're going to react in fits of agony using, the Greek meaning, the original dramatic meaning of these words. That's all I can say. I don't find it satisfying at a visceral level, but the calculus in the Kremlin is ultimately the ultimate satisfaction will be when we win, and they can't deny it any longer.
Follow strategic objectives. Mark, man, thank you for this. Mark Sloboda, International Relations Security Analyst. You guys can follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Sloboda1, on his YouTube channel at Real Politic with Mark Sloboda, and on Facebook at facebook.com/Grant. Man, always appreciate you, Mark. Yeah, and it's cynical, but right. In fact, more right than I think any other analysis that I've seen on these topics. So, man, thank you for this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Shout out to the one and only Mark Sloboda. I want to bring in my guest. Like I said, we have a full show today. Malik Abdul. He is a political analyst. There he is. Political analyst, writer, Republican strategist with over 15 years of public and private sector experience. My man, how you doing, man? You doing all right this morning?
I'm good. Let's see if we have better luck today with the StreamYard stream. But I'm prepared if it goes
what's
out.
Funny?
I'm prepared to switch to the phone.
The people were like, Malik is killing it. And one guy pointed out, he says, Malik will be on it and then it'll freeze. He said, damn it, Malik. He said he kept saying it, damn it, Malik.
Well, I'm ready today.
So you ready? Oh, got the do-rag and all of this. I got tied my do-rag, get ready for combat. So they passed they were able to get past the shutdown. We avoided it, thankfully, at the last minute. Trump did not get what he wanted in regards to the deficit thing, but for the most part, they were able to pass the shutdown bill. Give me your take on that. I mean, I think Trump said that they were going to primary any and everybody that had anything that would not vote for it. And I think it was like 170 Republicans voted for it. So is Trump going to primary 170 Republicans in the Senate?
No,
not too much.
And yeah, and if you notice, there were people who began, and actually Donald Trump started it himself, going after Chip Roy of Texas. So just so people know who Chip Roy is one of the 4 Republicans who joined the 208 Democrats to oust Kevin McCarthy. So Chip Roy has been a fan of many people on the right. Nancy Mace has been a fan of many people on the right. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, people were praising Nancy Mace as Wonder Woman because she every single day decided to talk about the trans bathroom issue in the Congress, which really wasn't an issue. But everybody loved Nancy Mace until Nancy Mace voted against the bill. So you had Jack Poso and all of these other people out here talking about attacking Nancy Mace, attacking Chip Roy. Now, notably, those are about the only ones. You maybe have about 5 that they've gone after, but those who voted, and let's be clear, those people who voted against what Donald Trump wanted, those 32 or so Republicans, they're not going after them, and a number of them are in the Freedom Caucus. So I call BS on a lot of this stuff anyway, and I'm glad that you pointed out, because I've been trying to tell people, if you listen to what they've said, they said, this is a win. They're voting against what Donald Trump wanted. You should be primaried because you're voting against what Donald Trump wanted. But what Donald Trump came out and said after, as Jayapal said, Shadow President Elon Musk came out against the bill, what Donald Trump said, I want a debt ceiling suspension attached to the negotiations. And then everything fell apart from that. But that happened at the end. There was no Mike Johnson has been around Donald Trump about as much as Elon Musk at this point. And we never heard anything about the debt ceiling negotiations until the end. But it wasn't even included. So all of these people who were talking about a win, or all of these people talking about, you voted against Donald Trump, you went up against Donald Trump. Well, it didn't even include the one thing that Donald Trump said. Now, I think that Donald Trump's point was valid about the debt ceiling. So if you go back to 2019, in the negotiations between Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi on the budget, there was a suspension of the debt ceiling, which is what Trump is asking for now. So that's why people don't remember during COVID in 2020, there was no debt ceiling debate because it had been suspended until 2021, which is right until when Joe Biden got in office. But a lot of these people, I'm glad. I did not want the government to shut down. You know how I am about government shutdown.
Yeah, I agree with you on this.
Government to shut down. But I did think that it was appropriate for them. I think they absolutely should do these individual bills. I don't think that it should be a big omnibus bill, even though they're trying to argue, well, this wasn't an omnibus, it was just a CR. Either way, it's a whole bunch of money. But I really have a problem. And you asked me how I feel about this. I really have a problem with Elon Musk, though. Because, I told you last week about him coming out lying about the stadium, lying about the salary increase
data in order to kill the bill. Yeah.
And you saw what happened just a little bit. Donald Trump showed a little leg yesterday at the AmFest festival when he made a point to say that I'm the president. He jokingly said Elon can't be president because he wasn't born in America. But Donald Trump was responding to a real concern that people have about how Elon Musk is interjecting himself in ways that is just not beneficial for the campaign itself.
I'm sorry. Oh, please continue.
No,
I was just going to play in the background.
There was a representative on yesterday. And just to tell you how Republicans have now shifted. Well, some of these conservatives have shifted to, we love our own billionaires now. There was a representative yesterday, and I don't know where he was from, but he was on one of the Sunday shows. This dude got on national television and said, we have President Donald Trump, we have Vice President JD Vance, and we have Prime Minister Elon Musk. And I said, what? Prime Minister, I think that I have been here. I've been in the trenches. So I've been here when people have been, oh, somebody wears a MAGA hat. Let's start. They're really serious about Donald Trump. Somebody said something nice about Donald Trump. Oh, yay. Let's Sink Uyghur, whatever his name, the guy from TYT or something.
Cenk Uygur. Yeah, Cenk
Oh,
Uygur.
Cenk Uygur. Even him. Now people are saying, oh, wow, listen to him. He's making sense. No, a lot of people are pivoting because they want that access to power. I don't trust a lot of these people. And at the end of the day, Elon Musk can decide, I'm going to go buy a yacht. I'm over this now. And then that's the end of it. I don't think he's vested in this at all. He's vested in the access that he's vested in the power that this access to Donald Trump gives him. That's all it is. He ain't America first. He is Elon Musk first.
Yeah, I agree with you on this. Prime Minister, that is outrageous. And just to back up the clip, just so people can hear what you were referring to, it was this. He pointed out of the blue, Elon Musk is not the shadow president for all intents and purposes. Come on.
And he got over 2,000 units. That's a lot. And they flooded it with Starlink, and it was so good. It saved a lot of lives, so we want to thank him. But no, he's not going to be president, that I can tell you. You know why? He can't be. He wasn't born in this country.
He said, I'm safe. You know why? He can't be born in this country. That's funny. So I'm curious on something else. Mike Johnson, as you pointed out, Mike Johnson has been one of those people very similar to Kevin McCarthy that seems to want government to work, even if he has to go to Democrats in order to make government work. But I've been reading right much that have pointed out that he has a target on his back at this point. Do you think Mike Johnson is going to be able to retain his, well, I guess we were talking about this before too, that it's going to be a close, I think you and I were talking about it, where it's going to be a very close vote because of some of so many members are being pulled into the administration itself that members are going to have to be rechosen with new elections. And Mike Johnson may only have 1 or 2 seat majority if he has that much. Do you think he's going to be able to retain his speakership, his leadership position?
I do. And to be honest, he has to. Donald Trump will ultimately support him in the end. The problem that they have is the same problem that they had with let's get rid of Kevin McCarthy. Who you going to replace him with? They said Mike Johnson was Mr. Conservative, even though I think the largest campaign that he had as far as spending was about $1 million in one of his races down there in Louisiana. No one really knew who this dude was, but they said, we got to get rid of Kevin McCarthy. Okay, well, that's how we got Speaker Johnson. The problem that they have is, if not Speaker Johnson, then who? Because more than likely with Steve Scalise's health issues, he is, I think, the number 2 in the House at this point, but he's not going to be elevated to the position. Jim Jordan probably won't be interested in being elevated to the speaker position. So you have no one. So even for those people who are saying we got to get rid of Mike Johnson, then you need a plan. If you want to get rid of your quarterback, then you need to know who your backup quarterback is going to be. And at this point, just saying that we want to get rid of Mike Johnson with no plan to replace him, that's going to be a problem. And the reason why I say he has to stay in that position, Donald Trump cannot afford. The big thing that people are going to be looking at are the first 100 days of the Trump administration. That's always important for any, you roll out your major plans and you're able to say at the end, within the first 100 days, this is what I did as president. All presidents do this. It is very important. Donald Trump cannot afford to have imagine if they had a prolonged battle for Speaker of the House. And let's say that goes until February. That means that none of Trump's, even after Trump had been inaugurated, none of Trump's agenda moves forward because Republicans in the House are still fighting over a speaker. So I think what will happen is that there will be, and this will be a test for the Trump campaign, because there are going to be a number of people who are not comfortable with Mike Johnson at all. But Chip Roy, the one who Trump and now the Jack Posos and others are out there attacking, you will need Chip Roy's vote. So it's going to be a lot of jockeying happen, but he absolutely needs a speaker, and that speaker needs to be Mike Johnson. We can't afford to try to find somebody else. He needs to be able to push his agenda through the first 100 days. And if we have a speaker fight, as we've had these last 2 times, it's going to be a problem. Remember, Kevin McCarthy, it was 15 times before Kevin McCarthy actually got his seat.
Yeah, that was humiliating. I had never seen anything like that. I'm curious from your take, what is going to be his first 100 days? Like, what are going to, from your take, what's going to be his priorities coming out? Because you're right. Usually that first 100 days is the thing that sets the tone, that defines what the presidency's agenda is going to be about. And Trump has already said he has legislation planned immediately, like meaning he has executive orders. He has all of these things that he wants to get done right off the bat. Like I said, he seems far more confident. He seems far more sure of himself. He's been president once before, so he seems like he has at least from his take, a grasp of it. And frankly, he's not going to take any shit off anybody this time around in the way he did with the Trump and Russia stuff. So what do you think his first 100 days is going to be? What is his top agenda items going forward?
Well, I think you made a point when you said he's been there, done that. Yeah, that's true. He's been there, done that. So he does have a different perspective because he's been in the seat and understand this whole governance thing. I think that there are going to be a number of things. So there are going to be some symbolic things, and those symbolic things are going to be those that he will issue, where he will issue executive orders. So things that Congress itself may need to fix, but he can symbol that, look out, I'm rolling back this. So, there are going to be some rollback of regulations. One of the big things that Donald Trump focused on in his first term when he was running for office, it was this whole idea for every 10 bad regulations, going to replace them with a good one. So it's going to be some symbolic thing of, like that stuff that will probably be helping Elon Musk. But it's going to be, so those type of regulations roll back. He's obviously the very first thing from not just executive orders, but everything that he could do through his Department of Homeland Security or Custom and Border CBP on immigration. That immigration is going to be a big issue. So the very first thing that he can do on that to tamp down on immigration, he's already talking about it. Tom Homan is already meeting with mayors around the country. So I think the plan is on day one, you're going to, because this is not a planning stage at this point. We're just ready for the execution, because again, they kind of know how to do this sort of thing. So you're going to see stuff around the economy where
everything was going great. Everything was going great. Okay, he will be back. Everything was going great. There was no issues.
Right.
There we are. No, I can hear you. Keep going. Okay. Malik is frozen. He will be back in a moment. When I see him moving around, he will be back in a moment. He's probably going to come back with his cell phone. Look, I guess his main point is the things. Look, Trump has said very early on that, he's going to define his administration by what did I say I was going to do versus what am I going to do? And so he has said that that is going to be one of his key plans. And when Malik comes back, one of the questions I want to bring up too is this kind of fight on the left, weirdly enough. Because there you are. Welcome back. Everything was going good. Everything was going good. No, it's perfectly fine. Everything was going great. Please just keep going. Keep going.
I don't understand what's going on
with the signal
streaming, because I just had to switch to my phone, so it's fine. But yeah, so I think he's going to definitely focus on those type of things that he could do. Things, whatever agency implementing policies at the agency, he's probably going to try to do something on trans, like athletes, that type of thing. But you're going to see I would probably say a typical thing, but immigration for sure, stuff around the economy. I think those are probably going to be like for 1 and 2 on this list of things that Donald Trump is going to do.
I want you to hear, and I'm glad you brought up Cenk Uygur. I was fascinated by this. So, every so often there are fights on the left. And in these fights on the left, you get these, in this case, it's very weird because you get a group like TYT, the Young Turks, and then you get Majority Report. And the Young Turks seem to have had this come to Jesus moment where they realize some of the policies that the left go with are just not popular. Like this notion of trans kids, for example. Doesn't matter whether it's 1 or 2, it's not popular. There's a reason for it. Nancy Mace, where she's hitting the trans bathroom things again, there's a reason she's hitting it. She knows it's not popular. And so Uygur seemed to have, like you pointed out, pivoted on certain issues. He still goes with the lefty bona fides. But Uygur, to be fair to Uygur, has always gone with this idea of anti-establishment. Basically, it's this idea of the anti-establishment versus the establishment. And that establishment could be Democrats or Republicans. The issue that the public has is that they don't like the established order. So I want to play this clip. And I want to get your take on this because he's been getting a lot of heat from other lefties on this. But on this, I actually think he's somewhat more right than not. I think the other lefties are extremists, like liberal extremism, in the way that they're going with this stuff. And they're acting like it's a cult, that the moment that somebody pivots a little bit in order to try to find a larger coalition, which is the point of electoral politics, that they're hitting them on it, like, how dare you pivot? But this is Uygur.
They just booed me. And what I mean by that is not a revolution against the Democratic Party or the left or the country, but a revolution against the establishment. So I knew you guys were for real in fighting against the establishment when I started going on right-wing shows and I would say something negative about Mitch McConnell. And when I did that in the past, what I would get back is, oh, no, Mitch McConnell's great. Pelosi's terrible, but Mitch McConnell's great.
Let's do that here. What do you guys think of Mitch McConnell?
So I agree with him on this. Like, the rub is many people like the Sam Cedar, for example, these kind of Democratic adjacent lefties, people who are basically creatures of the Democratic Party, even though they have a little bit more license to be a little bit more further out, but they'll always say vote for whatever random Democrat that they put up, regardless of how weak that Democrat is. They have been attacking him because he has taken this kind of attack of, well, no, we can align with the anti-establishment right in the areas to which we agree. Give me your take on that. Do you think this is an act? Do you think he has come to Jesus on some level? Meaning, it's not that he's abandoning his lefty bona fides. It's just he's thinking, I need a larger political coalition in order to win. And if there are people on the right who I may be able to bring onto our side, or at the very least to work on items that we can agree on, then I'm willing to do that. And look, I'll tell you this before I let you come in on this. I have had people who used to watch my show who used to just come on to troll. I remember one guy sent me a letter. He says, dude, I just used to watch your show just to troll. And he said, then I realized after like 6 months that I was watching your show every day. Meaning it transitioned from I'm there to troll to I'm an active viewer for the show. He says, I am hard right. He says, but I agree with about 70% of the stuff that you say. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, then you're not hard right. You're just the person who have identified yourself with a particular disposition for whatever reason. If Uygur is on the similar track, is that like that's a good thing, right? I mean, I'm asking this question in a weird way. Do you agree or disagree with that, or do you think he's grifting in this?
Well, I think that, so for one, I don't follow him, so I get clips of which you see, I didn't even know how to pronounce his name. So I've only seen him on social media, the things I've caught clips of things that he said about Donald Trump and Donald Trump supporters over the years. So for me, I don't trust him. It's great that he's coming to this awakening. If it's sincere, I welcome all of that. The point that he was making about being attacked from the left, because he actually went on to, went and met with someone considered on the right. That is a real thing. That is one of the many things that people not just hate about politics. It's one of the things that you see people now saying about what great, like when they are pulling away from the Democratic Party, they cite these type of things because, I mean, we do it on the right too, but you on the left, you attack your allies. Think of over the years, Van Jones saying not so nasty things about Donald Trump. Well, he gets attacked for that. Think about if you go on to a Fox News. Oh, well, you go on Fox News. You're a Democrat who goes on Fox News. You're for the Fox News audience. That's very different than what Kamala Harris did, basically like wrapping herself like an umbilical cord around Liz Cheney. That's very different from that. I think there is space for people to even later on in life to say, well, you know what? Looking back, because you see people now doing these type of reflective, well, maybe. Now I put Jank, whatever it is, I put him when you talk about, do I think it's grifting? It very well may not be, but I put him in the same boat that I put Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski. They may have had an awakening, but I literally do not, and I will not trust you. On the other side of that, what I don't like from the right is that we love when somebody says that they like us. We love when somebody says that we like Donald Trump. We love when a rapper says something that seem to be complimentary of Donald Trump. We love when somebody who says that he's the Black Lives Matter president somewhere in Vermont or Maine says that he endorses Donald Trump. We love, I was just looking at Fox News the other day. There was somebody that they were interviewing from an event where they were going after the mayor Johnson in Chicago, and Fox News had him on, and I just heard him in the background. I hadn't even seen him. I knew he was black because you could tell. And I said to myself, he probably got on the MAGA hat. Well, I'd be damned. I turned right on around. And now this dude has no history in politics, but he had on a MAGA hat. And that's the only thing that they wanted. I don't trust a lot of these people who come to the party late, although I welcome all to the party. So for me, this dude getting praised at an AmFest event while Mitch McConnell is being booed. See, I already think that Poso is a grifter anyway, so I definitely think that about him. And so we invite somebody like Jank to come in, and then we wrap our arms around him simply because he may be saying things that we like. I don't trust that at all. I don't trust Jay, but I definitely don't trust people like Poso and others who amplify him just because they are no longer saying nasty things about Trump or Republicans. I don't like that.
Oh man, we're gonna have to find a way to have a middle ground.
But you can, and see, the thing is that there are people who are able to. So a lot of people don't like Harold Ford. Harold Ford is a former congressman from Tennessee. He's now in New York, and he's a longtime Democrat, more of a blue dog Democrat, but people attack him because he's on Fox News. But he articulates himself well. He's a very in the middle type of guy. I think that there are a number of things. You don't do it for performative sake. Even in your criticism of Donald Trump or the people who support Donald Trump, it is not part of your shtick. It is not a performance. A lot of these people, this is what you did to make a name for yourself, being nasty. And then now you say, I want to be reasonable here. Well, okay, that is very different. That is very different from people like you who can be objective, and even in the objectivity sees no reason to be nasty and build a name for yourself being provocative. Like, that's what that is. That's the part I don't like.
Fair enough. I mean, I guess it'll take time to see where this goes. Because look, you could be right. It could be a grift. It could be, oh, I need to increase my audience. It could be all sorts of reasons for it. Man, thank you.
It can be sincere.
Yeah,
it can be sincere.
Yeah, he could be feeling in the dark, and looking for something, realizing something is wrong, trying to figure out what it is. Dude, thank you for that. Well,
Of
that's the way
course.
Carville explained it. Carville was like, I'm feeling in the dark. I'm trying to figure out what's wrong. I don't know what's wrong.
That's valid.
Yeah.
I'm gonna use that. And by
And
the
I
way,
like
before I go, just so your audience will know, if they don't cancel on me, I'll be on CNN tonight on Abby's show at 10 o'clock. So watch me tonight at the round table. We'll see who's there around Abby's table tonight at 10 o'clock.
Congratulations, man. That's damn good.
Well, they always cancel, so we'll see.
Well,
That's why I
I'm
said.
hoping they don't this time. I'm hoping they take it this time. Malik Abdul, he's a political analyst, writer, Republican strategist with over 15 years of experience in the private sector. And hopefully we will see him on CNN tonight at 8 o'clock. Thanks, my man.
10.
I really appreciate it. 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock. Merry
Alrighty.
Christmas, man. Thank you for this.
Same to you, man.
All right. I would like to bring in my next guest, if I can get to it. There we are. Another good friend of the show who I deeply appreciate joining me today because I needed his context. I hit him up yesterday. I was like, this doesn't even sound right. Michael Maloof. He is a former senior security policy analyst in the Office of Secretary of Defense, author, and regular contributing analyst on RT and other media outlets. He has nearly 30 years of federal experience in the U.S. Department of Defense. Well, Merry Christmas, man. How you doing today? You doing all right?
Same to you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I brought you on because I needed some context on the attack, on the Houthi attack. So the UK, the United States, launched a withering attack on Yemen. Yemen, in retaliation for that attack, and I guess there were multiple things. Yemen attacked Tel Aviv, the UK and the United States hit them back. But in response, the Houthis apparently fired, I believe they said 8 missiles, several drones, and somewhere along the way, the Houthis claim we took down a F-18. The military, the U.S. military said, well, there was a friendly fire mistake where we knocked the plane out of the sky by accident, but the pilots were able to abandon the airplanes. And I think my first thing was like, okay, well, was it even possible for the Houthis to do that with drones and cruise missiles? Give me your take on that. I mean, are the Houthis lying? What's more likely to be true? Is it more likely to be friendly fire, or the Houthis more likely to have taken down that plane?
Yeah, CENTCOM said that the plane was hit shortly after takeoff. That's from CENTCOM, and that it was down due to friendly fire. I don't know that the Houthis had all they had were drones and maybe a few ballistic missiles that were aimed at the ships, but they did not have ground to air systems in action that I'm aware of. And the fact that this aircraft was downed just after takeoff suggests to me that the ordnance on the aircraft carrier, as well as the surrounding ships, because it is a strike group out there, they probably there was probably lead flying everywhere, using Gatling guns, which shoot 6,000 rounds a minute. And I wouldn't doubt that they just got into the crosshairs or into the crossfires, I should say, of trying to down these drones that were coming in. I don't think that they were taken down by the Houthis, that this aircraft was taken down by the Houthis. Now, it's still subject to further investigation, but for CENTCOM to claim that it was due to friendly fire is a major admission. But again, I didn't. That sounded about right to me because, again, speculation. But there was no assessment that the Houthis were using ground-to-air missiles, which would be against aircraft flying that I was aware of, and especially since it just had taken off from the aircraft carrier, according to CENTCOM. So now, if it was flying near Sana'a, the capital, maybe that's a possibility, but that's not where the location was of this aircraft at the time of having been allegedly shot down.
Yeah, for some reason I remember reading somewhere that they got confused because of the drone attack that was coming in. Like because I agree with you. It sounds like they were shooting at the drones to take the drones down. and somehow accidentally hit the ship. Now the Gatling guns, so the guns on the ships themselves, do they have friend versus foe type device? So that's only on the missile systems, meaning the guns.
They have a guide. They have a guidance. They can lock in. They can lock in. It'd be done manually or by computer by tracking it. But let's say they were firing and the plane's taking off and another ship on nearby was shooting at an incoming drone, and the plane happened to cross into that direction. Anything is possible. I mean, because you got lead flying. Look, 6,000 rounds a minute. One Gatling gun could shoot, and that's just the Gatling gun. That doesn't include the missiles. Now, I suspect it was down that the aircraft was down by a Gatling gun to take down the drone, and that's what's normally used. We do use more expensive for ballistic missiles. We'll use the more expensive upgraded missiles. But if a drone, which is slow, is coming in toward a ship, that to me is probably what's used, and maybe even a missile. But it sounds more like it was the Gatling gun effect, and because of the fact that there was reportedly an accidental shoot down.
Yeah.
And,
wow.
They just,
that is,
it's unlike the Ukrainian F-16 that was shot down, which from what I can gather did not have a transponder on, and it was a Ukrainian ground-to-air missile that downed that F-16 initially when they got the F-16s and were putting them into operation, and it downed their top F-16 pilot, and so the transponder apparently was not functioning, or it wasn't turned on, that allowed the ground-to-air missiles to have a recognition, or it may not have even been programmed, for all I know. So
they might not even know.
We just don't know yet, and there's never been any follow-up story on that, by the way.
Yeah, that's been buried. That's been buried. They just kind of moved on for that one. I'm curious, when they're launching cruise missiles, because the Houthis said they launched several cruise missiles also. Those were aimed at the ship, not the airplane, correct?
Yeah. The cruise missile, and they're slow. They're relatively slow. And you're not going to have a cruise missile is not going to be shooting down an aircraft that's just launched from the deck of an aircraft carrier. Those drones and cruise missiles are meant to be aimed at the ships per se. That's what the Houthis were saying that they were targeting, were the ships, not the aircraft.
Yeah,
and you're talking about a considerable distance.
Oh, right. I assume they were just in the coast. Well, right. They said they were in the Red Sea, and you're right. Those planes can take off from a considerable distance. That's such a good point. So they said they launched 8 cruise missiles, 17 drones, and so those things were probably shot down in the process of trying to shoot it down. They accidentally knocked down their own plane in the process.
They could have knocked down their own plane. That's my assessment.
Wow.
Based upon what I've heard.
Give me your take on something. How the Houthis, I mean, the United States, they've been doing this kind of, what is it, Operation Prosperity Garden, or something to that effect, I believe the name of the operation is. They've been doing this for nearly a year, if not more than a year at this point, in order to stop the Houthis. A few years ago, the Houthis were literally in starvation because of the war they were having with Saudi Arabia. And now they're launching missiles that are going at hypersonic speeds. How are they doing that? Like, how is this Iran giving them something behind the scenes? Like, how on earth have they been able to make this kind of military jump over the course of this very short period of time like this, especially for something this sophisticated in regards to weapons? They launched a missile that hit Tel Aviv yesterday.
Yeah.
Which is, again, astonishing. This is not like, it seems that the accuracy has gotten far more specific and far better over the course of this last year. How are they getting this level of technological development this fast?
I wouldn't doubt that they're getting outside help. But they also have an indigenous capability. They've always had it, starting with the old Scud Seas that the Houthis acquired when they took over the capital, and they've been running those for years. I'm sure they have their own indigenous development programs, but also receiving outside technical assistance and know-how. And so I think it's just inevitable that they would do it. We've for our part, we've helped increase the capabilities of other countries doing the same thing. So, and we basically have provided a lot of that technological know-how, let's say, to China over time. Now they're developing stealth systems that I can almost trace the U.S. exports. There were 3 of them that we gave in the 90s to the Chinese that gave them the basis to develop their stealth program, and they built upon that ever since, and then acquired further assistance and know-how. These countries are not as isolated as we think they are, like Russia or China, due to sanctions. Forget it. I mean, there is an ability to acquire. When I was in Russia recently, I saw so many foreign cars on the roads and late model cars, and I'm thinking, and the grocery stores are stocked, and people are going about their everyday lives like it's a normal day, and I'm thinking, sanctions? What sanctions?
You were in Kazan, of all places, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because Kazan was just hit by a drone. I guess it was a series of drones. And apparently there were, I mean, again, this had no military significance at all to it. From your take, why Kazan? I mean, apparently there were multiple attacks over the course of in Kursk region, also in Kazan itself. Why do you think it was Kazan? Do you think it was just a terror target? Do you think there was any kind of significance to it? Give me your thoughts. I mean, my first thought was BRICS, but I wasn't necessarily sure. Give me your thoughts. You were there.
I was as you point out, I was there in October for the BRICS summit, and I was covering that for RT as a contributor. And there was a lot of jamming going on at that time because there were something like 40 world leaders who had shown up for the BRICS conference, and so there was a lot of electronic jamming going on out of concern for the very thing that happened a few days ago, and that is drone attacks. And if you'll recall, you and I were supposed to have a chat while I was in Kazan, and I couldn't get through because the internet was jammed at the time, so I couldn't make it. You probably thought I was kidding at the time, but now this really underscores the importance of why they were so cautious, even in Kazan. In Kazan is the 5th largest Russian city. It's the capital of Tartarstan, and it's older. The city itself is older than the city of Moscow, and it is a crossroads between a trade crossroads, if you would, between China and the West through Russia, historically. I think even Ivan the Terrible turned up there at one point, and that was what, the 13th or 14th. Yeah, a little before my time. Yeah, a little before my time. But the significance of it is that it is a provincial city. It's a capital. They actually have what they call the Kazan Kremlin there. It's a walled city. It's an ancient city, and they have a mosque and they have an Eastern Orthodox church side by side, and people go and visit. You can visit them. It displayed how Muslims and Christians have lived in harmony for centuries together in Kazan, and it is predominantly a Muslim controlled area, and this is one of the attributes that Putin points to as to how they have all of these ethnicities and various religious groups with embodied within the Russian Federation. I think that is a very significant thing. They have them of all stripes there, and it's just like it's in effect like a melting pot, if you will, just as we are. I think we're more of a melting pot because of the folks that come around the world to us. But they can show a lot of diversity in their society, even in Russia, and even though it's in the more western part of Russia, it's more Eastern Orthodox, and you readily see that, particularly in Moscow, St. Petersburg. But Kazan is about 800 miles inside from Ukraine, and I think the latest display of shooting drones there, even though there was no apparent military target, there was no military objective. It hit civilian high rise there in an area which was near where I was staying. But it was to demonstrate by drone, a domestically produced drone by the Ukrainians, that they have a long range capability. And it's much larger, much longer than the ATACMS that they want. The benefit of the ATACMS is speed, and as a consequence, they are able to still wreak damage and havoc if they want to.
Well, it's wild. I was showing this picture earlier. It looked honestly, it looked almost like 9/11. I mean, granted, it didn't have the same impact because it was a drone. It didn't have the same significance or the right here. Here it is, just for the audience, just in case the audience wasn't here earlier today. This basically a residential building.
Yeah.
I mean that it really did. I mean for Americans, it evokes this kind of 9/11 feel to it, just in the way it looks like an airplane just hitting the building itself, which is astonishing. There's something else I want to hit you with too. So the military recently, right here, this. Apparently, the number of troops that we're sending to Syria is double, apparently, than what the military believed. I have no idea why they don't know how many troops, but maybe you can answer this. I want to play the clip, and I want to get your take on it.
To bring up one item, as you know, we have been briefing you regularly that there are approximately 900 U.S. troops deployed to Syria. In light of the situation in Syria and the significant interest, we recently learned that those numbers were higher. And so asked to look into it. I learned today that, in fact, there are approximately 2,000 U.S. troops in Syria. As I understand it, and as it was explained to me, these additional forces are considered temporary rotational forces that deploy to meet shifting mission requirements, whereas the core 900 deployers are on longer deployments. As you know, for many of our deployments, numbers will fluctuate from time to time, but given that this number is significantly higher than what we've been briefing.
Well, not just significantly higher, but like more than double the amount that he was saying that was there before. I mean, that's a significant jump. I mean, like it's one thing to say, okay, we have 900 core troops. Okay, but this is a double than the number of troops that you had prior. How could they not know how many people they had in Syria? Or is what he is saying a legitimate excuse for how they got this so wrong?
I think I don't believe a word they say. They have to know, because they have to cut the orders. They have to move people around. I think they were basically hiding this fact prior to the elections, but they had to have been there prior to the elections. And so, but the Pentagon was just keeping it quiet. They didn't want to do anything that's going to upset everybody more than they already have, and particularly with what would constitute an expansion of the war. but they are sitting ducks. They are much more susceptible to attacks from not only the Sunnis, but also the Shia coming in from Iraq. Oh.
You're fine. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm super. Oh,
I have a incoming that I'm going to have to tell. But
you're perfectly fine. Michael, thank you for this, man.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Let's
No,
talk
I
later.
really appreciate it. You have a good one. All right. Ended a little soon, but that's okay. I do appreciate him. I asked him to come on and have a conversation about the building and the viability of whether or not the Houthis had the chance to take down the building. So fair enough. He gave me 20, and I am deeply appreciative of him for it. The other story I was going to hit Maloof with, and I'll just go through the story now, because I don't think the troop numbers are completely arbitrary. This was reported. Syrian rebel Ahmed al-Shara. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, who the hell is al-Shara? Who's al-Shara? What do you mean Syrian leader al-Shara? I thought Jolani was in charge. Well, Jolani is in charge because al-Shara is Jolani. He has effectively got rid of his battle name and is now going by al-Shara. Now, he is standing there. If you notice, well, they may not show it on this video, but he is here with the Turkish foreign minister. And they're having a great conversation. They seem to be thick as thieves as they're talking and all this other good stuff. Good, right there. In this conversation, one of the things that he points out, well, for one, it's clear that Turkey and al-Jolani, or Shara, whatever he wants to call himself, Ahmed al-Shara, are very tight, thick as thieves, regardless of Turkey saying they didn't have anything to do with it. It just happened. We didn't know anything about it. But now, of course, Turkey is strongly insisting that sanctions need to be removed, that Erdogan is pointing out, well, we need to do something about terrorists. And they go further. If you remember on the show, I think it was last week, I had Esteban on the show. And Esteban pointed out that there are thousands of ISIS fighters that are in detainment, in prison. And that as the jihadists gets closer, what are they going to do? I mean, keep in mind, many of these guys were ISIS. Many of these guys are still ISIS. And what are they going to do when they come across a prison? Are they going to let their people go? Or for that matter, are they going to let their people join the terrorist state? All right. One of the conversations that they had, and that Jolani seems to be strongly insisting, is that he can be trusted, that the West has nothing to fear from him. And one of the things that he pointed out was that he was going to get rid of all of the weapons and put all of those weapons under the state apparatus. That this is what he's going to do all across the country. So we're right here. Syria's armed faction will be dissolved in an international army with all weapons coming under state control. The country's de facto leader, Ahmed al-Shara, or al-Jolani, as he is commonly known, said on Sunday at the press conference with the Turkish foreign minister, Hakan Fidan. Shara said that the measure also applied to groups in areas controlled by the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. Basically, groups that are backed by the U.S. Groups that are backed by the U.S. So, if you remember Blinken, well, there were a few things. One, after they took over the Syrian government, there were clashes between Kurdish forces backed by the United States, basically jihadists backed by the U.S., and jihadists backed by Turkey or Turkey, choose whatever you want to call it. And in these clashes, the better trained, better equipped Turkish-backed jihadists were beating the stuffing out of the US-backed jihadists. So Blinken goes over. Apparently there is a deal. The deal is somewhat short-lived because they were still losing territory to the Turkish-backed groups. Now, Erdogan has come out and is effectively like, look, we are not going to accept terrorists in Syria. Al-Jolani or Shara, the name change. I want to hit the name change for after a bit. But first, he points out that all groups, be it Hezbollah affiliates, all groups will have to leave if they're not necessarily going to be part of Syria. He continues that rhetoric with, we are going to disarm every group that is in Syria. All factions need to give up their weapons. And if they're going to be militarized, they will have to join the Syrian army. So his first thought is, we need to get rid of all competition. There's so many groups that are affiliated with HTS when they overthrew the government. Many of those groups have different ideas. They have different tolerances in regards to what they accept versus what they don't accept. And so you can imagine that Jolani is like, all right, this is problematic, and I need to somehow ensure control and stability for the state. And so in order to do that, I need to disarm the other groups that are competitors that may cause an issue for me and my power base in this country. Now, he is supposed to be having elections, and there's a question of whether or not he would even give up power if he lost in the elections. But put that to the side for the moment. That's a big deal. Part of the reason that's a big deal is because currently they are still fighting with Kurdish forces. Now, I pointed out earlier that more likely than not, they're going to want to take over all of Syria. The most expensive, or let's say the most prosperous regions of Syria were being held by the Kurdish forces at the behest of the United States. So the areas of the oil, or for that matter, the wheat, part of the reason that the US did that is because at the point where their terrorists were losing, well, they decided we need to hold on to the oil and wheat in order to deprive this element from the Syrian government. So we're going to starve the population of energy, and we're going to starve them of food. And that's what they did. They did for years. And so the Kurdish forces were basically stealing the oil, and American forces that were on the ground were stealing the oil. As Trump said that day, we're stealing the oil, we're stealing the oil. All right. So I have a hard time believing that a group that is backed by Turkey, that has overthrown the Syrian government, that is now taking out the Kurds, the same Kurds that the Turkish government considers to be terrorists, and that Jolani has just pointed out will be disarmed. Full stop. And you can imagine that Turkey is going to back them wholeheartedly in disarming the group that Turkey considers to be a terrorist. Now, the catch becomes, what does the US do? The fact of the matter is the US, as the general pointed out, or whoever the spokesperson is, only has, 2,000 people in the country, which is more than twice the amount than they originally said that they had in the country itself. And I would imagine that basically came to a head where they had to out that information. So there's a question to be asked of, okay, what does the US do? Is the US going to go to war with Turkish-backed jihadists? And more to the point, not just are they going to go to war with Turkish-backed jihadists. I mean, Turkey has taken this perspective that we have nothing to do with that government. We'll help them. We can help them. And we had nothing to do with the overthrow of Syria. Okay, nobody believes this. Certainly the United States doesn't believe this. But one of the benefits of having a proxy is that the proxy can touch things that you can't necessarily touch directly. And so there's a question of whether or not the US is going to stand by the Kurds, or whether the US is going to allow the Kurds to get crushed. Now, there is some level of diplomatic work that Blinken is doing that doesn't necessarily seem to be all that effective. Those groups are still going after the Kurdish forces. And again, from the Erdogan's position, he wants all of Syria. And at the point where the United States has invaded the country and is occupying the most, let's say, oil-rich regions of that country, why would he accept the US forces remaining in Syria now that he's been able to get rid of Bashar al-Assad, and that he wants, for all intents and purposes, to be able to take it all? Now, of course, Israel has taken a portion of Syria, but there's a question of whether or not the Kurds are going to be left in the lurch, especially when Donald Trump gets in office, because there's rumors that Donald Trump wants to pull out of Syria. And if indeed Trump wants to pull out of Syria, then the full responsibility of taking care of the, let's say, the ISIS fighters is going to fall to HTS, and which is effectively now Syria. What's wild about that is that the Turkish foreign minister has pointed out that HTS is prepared and ready to occupy state power, meaning take over the state, and they're also ready to take control of the terrorists in those prisons that the Kurdish forces were guarding. So they are making moves. Now, part of the moves that they're also making is trying to get rid of the sanctions. Because, again, part of the thing that crushed Bashar al-Assad were the sanctions. I mean, they were paying their military like $20 a month compared to the, $1,500 a month that they were getting from the standpoint of back by Turkish and the U.S. forces when they overthrew the Syrian government. So their first thought is, we need to get the state up and running. In order to get the state up and running, we need to get rid of the sanctions. Now, al-Jolani has traded his Zelensky-esque outfit for a suit. And in rocking the suit, he is saying, look, we need to remove the sanctions. Those sanctions were part of the old government. We are the new government. And he's trying to make this argument that, look, we are the victors. We are the people who are the oppressed. And because we were the people who are the oppressed, you should not put sanctions on the oppressed as you had on the oppressor. Now, the reason he can use this argument is because that's the argument that the West effectively used in order to back him, despite the fact there's a $10 million bounty on his head that is still there, that Joe Biden or the Biden administration is considering to removing. Now, we will see how this pans out, but the truth of the matter is it sounds like the Kurds are going to get screwed over again. I have a hard time believing that Erdogan is going to be okay with allowing the Kurdish forces to remain in the country now that his proxy has effectively overthrown and taken control of the state apparatus in its entirety. Yes, Israel. They may not necessarily come to odds with Israel anytime soon, but from the standpoint of the SDF, they consider them to be terrorists and they want them gone. And so I'm not quite sure how much influence or pull the United States is going to have at this situation. Up to this point, it doesn't seem like they've had much pull at all in order to stem the hand of Turkish proxies to get rid of the Kurds. It's just fascinating. I mean, they have fundamentally taken the country. And I'm super curious on whether or not the U.S. is going to remove A, the sanctions, or B, the bounty on his head. Now, they may keep those sanctions with the idea that we'll remove the sanctions if you leave the Kurds to their devices, meaning that may be the leverage that they use in order to try to stem his hand on some of this stuff. And of course, they've also, Europe anyway, has pointed out that we will remove the sanctions if you can attend to human rights or if you can attend to the elections, those type of things, basically using a carrot and stick approach and trying to control the group. Whether that's going to work, I have no idea. But that is the situation in Syria right now. He is saying he is going to disarm every armed faction that is in Syria, and that all of those armed factions are going to have to come under the auspices of the government itself. Will the other armed groups accept that? That is also an open question. Meaning, will they accept themselves being depowered and being disarmed? Especially if there's disagreements between the leadership and the rest of the groups that are there, or some of the groups that are there. It's just fascinating in the way that this is breaking down. We'll see. He seems to be trying to take moves or make moves in order to prevent the same thing that happened in Syria, or for that matter, the same thing that happened in Iraq, with this kind of fracturing and breaking of the government. And it seems that the pathway that he's going by doing that is by effectively getting rid of all the weapons. Now, I live in America. There are guns everywhere. And if you tried to remove all of the guns in America, I think you would have a hard time of doing it. And it may be something similar in Syria. Just because you go with that plan, for one, that plan may alienate some of those groups that may not trust you in the first place. And B, those groups may not necessarily want themselves to be disempowered in that way. The other thing is the name. So changing the name from al-Jolani, and then all of a sudden, all of the media is using the term Shahara. It's a little weird and a little bit jarring. It's a little weird and a little jarring. Now, the reason they're doing it, though, is because It's kind of like UFOs and UAPs. Well, this guy has been known as a terrorist through and through, whether it was with ISIS, Al Qaeda, et cetera, meaning he has been a head chopper for his entire political identity. In the same way that I would have newsman beside my name, if somebody's trying to figure out, okay, what does he do? What's in my bio? His would have, I chop heads, and I have chopped heads for like a decade. So if you're trying to separate yourself and trying to create this new identity, and this identity that does not have a head chopper beside it, meaning you're trying to come up with something different. You're trying to say, hey, I'm in a suit. I'm clean cut. I'm not wearing a turban. I'm not wearing any of that stuff. I'm a modern leader. I'm a diversity-friendly terrorist. That's what I am. And so he's trying to disassociate himself from his previous self. It's almost like he's trying to create a new version to which he can occupy. He's stepping into a new person and a new individual, symbolized by removing the old name. This was my battle name. This was my war name. This was the name that I used when I was, a warrior of Allah. But now I'm a politician. And as a politician, I look different. I sound different. I'm more modern. I'm more tolerant of other groups and other people and of democratic norms and a democratic system. And so I do not want to be called Jolani. That guy chops heads. I want to be called Shawara. I want to be called Ahmed al-Shawara. That's the name change. It's a disassociation of who he was. This idea that people are going to somehow forget that the guy is a terrorist by changing the name, in the same way that people are supposed to get that UAPs or UFOs just because you changed the name. I still call it a UFO because that's what it is. That's what I learned it to be. And them changing the name of it doesn't necessarily change my perspective of it. By the same token, give it 10 years. Maybe the different name will give a different context to the new people who are coming up in the new Syrian government. That's assuming the Syrian government can stay intact over that period of time, or for that matter, that he is even in the political space. The fact that he's changing his name, though, makes it seem that he is trying to stay in the political space. Otherwise, what's the point? On another issue, the Russian troops that are there. In fact, I think somebody said something about the Russian troops. That says Russian pulling out of Syria. Yes. So it seems that Russia is pulling out of Syria and moving into Libya. Now, this is kind of self-evident as to why. For one, I would imagine they think Erdogan screwed them over, or at the very least outmaneuvered them. Two, in every situation where Erdogan had the ability to try to get some kind of advantage, Erdogan took it. And so you don't necessarily want your forces to be at the behest of Turkish forces, or for that matter, Turkish proxies, or for that matter, at the whim of Erdogan. That's the last thing that you want. Meaning, even if Erdogan gives you some kind of deal and shakes your hand, doesn't necessarily mean that he would ever attend to that deal, especially if the situation changes in a way where he can get some kind of advantage out of you. So yeah, from their point of view, it is in their best interest to call it a day. Now, the other question becomes, if they're in Libya, are there other factions in Libya that the West is going to side with to oppose the Russians in Libya also, which is also probably true. So whatever issues that they were taking in Syria, that they were in contest, is probably also going to end up being some kind of contest in Libya moving forward. But at the very least, I would imagine Russian troops don't feel safe in Syria, and most likely will feel safer somewhere like Libya, where they can stay in the area when not necessarily being under Turkish domination or Turkish influence. So that is also taking place. The events are wild, man. The events that are taking place in the Middle East are wild. I had a conversation with Morandi yesterday, and Morandi pointed out, I asked him about, there we are, I asked him about Iran and what is Iran's take to the fall of Syria. And Morandi pointed out that a new formulation is being made. And I asked him, what do you mean new formulation is being made? And he acknowledged that with the fall of Syria, Israel has a better ability to pivot and attack Iran. And part of that has to do with the air defenses that Israel no longer has to maneuver through. So for all the attacks that were taking place on Syria, where Israel was hitting it like every other day or something to that effect, apparently they were still limited in what they could do in order to hit it, meaning there was still air defense in Syria that could hit Israeli warplanes, but apparently those planes would take certain actions or attacks that would avoid being hit by those planes or avoid going into areas that were heavily dominated by air defense. The fact that Syria has fallen and they've taken explicit action to destroy any and everything that might have been some kind of tool or weapon that the new government could use to A, defend itself, or B, attack Israel, anything else, at this point, they feel like they have a free hand to potentially attack Iran. Now, when I asked Morandi about True Promise 3, why has True Promise 3 been avoided? And more to the point of not just avoided, was it a mistake to not join in with Hezbollah, or for that matter, Hamas, when they were going after Israel? And his thing was like, look, True Promise 3 would not necessarily have avoided that. That's true, but, joining in, and the reason why I asked that question is because now Hezbollah has been ameliorated. Gaza has been isolated. Houthis are still firing, but Houthis are very far away, and they're firing a missile every blue moon at Tel Aviv or something to that effect, even though they are working to take ships out of the Red Sea. And so Iran has been isolated on some level. It's like, yes, they're going to have a security guarantee with Russia, but we don't necessarily know what is going to be in that security guarantee. He pointed out that they are prepared or preparing for an attack by the United States. That it's one thing to be attacked by Israel. It's another thing to have to deal with attacks coming from America. And that any attack that they were going to leverage at first is now have to take into the accommodation or take into account that the U.S. may be involved into that attack, meaning their situation has become more fraught. Now, he is putting on a confident demeanor with this, but clearly in that conversation, he was making it clear that there's a new formulation that is being done now that Syria has fallen, even though, there's a new formulation that's being done. There's nothing to add to it. The Middle East is getting fascinated, man. The other item has to do with Romania. And I am very fortunate to have a guest to have that conversation with. I am deeply, my great gratitude, Daniel, because I know it was a quick turnaround from last week to this week, but you were gracious enough to cover the story for me. And this was something that you're following, European politics. And so I was fortunate to get your take on it. And I thank you for being able to get your continued take on this. It's a fascinating story. Daniel Lazar is an independent journalist and author, best known as a critic of the U.S. Constitution, American politics, government, and social policy in general. He's written several books, including America's Undeclared War, Frozen Republic, and more. Thank you for this, Daniel. How you doing this morning? You doing all right?
I'm doing fine.
So, Romania. So we were told that the Russians intruded in the election. And just to give a just to give a basic background, Colin Georgescu came out of nowhere. And he was one of those people, even though they call him pro-Russian, he's not really pro-Russian. He's just a nationalist in the context of Romania. And I think he would probably describe himself as looking out for the best interests of Romania. Well, this was not necessarily light. And there was accusations that because he came out of nowhere, that there was anomalies in the case, meaning there were anomalies in the campaign itself, and that the Russians were involved in TikTok operations and influencer operations in order to get Georgescu over the finish line in the first election. So in the middle of the second election, while they were actually, if I'm not mistaken, counting the votes in the second election, the court came in and canceled the election, basically just nuked it, claiming that, well, the intelligence said that the Russians were involved. Come to find out, lo and behold, it wasn't the Russians at all. It says, according to Snoop.ro report, the Romanian agency found that the liberals had paid for the social media campaign to TikTok through influencers and by promoting hashtag, which ended up being hijacked to benefit Georgescu. Instead, the Liberals are junior coalition partners in the outgoing government, and their candidate, Nikolai, I think this is Kirka, placed fifth in the annulled first round. So this was the National Liberation Party. It paid external firm Kensington Communication to implement social media campaign. It says in the statement, Kensington Communication wrote, if the campaign had been cloned or hijacked in favor of one candidate or another, we ask the competent bodies to verify and take the necessary measures. The company also said the script they sent out to influencers for the campaign had been altered. Okay. From my understanding, the script just said something like make a responsible choice in regards to the candidate. Now, they are now saying that the campaign was hijacked. Georgescu is pointing out that he has taken this to the Supreme Court, and he is trying to get this effectively revoked, annulled, meaning the annulment annulled. This is rather astonishing. It wasn't the Russians, it was the National Liberal Party that apparently was responsible. Give me your take on this. I mean, I find this to be rather outrageous that they annulled an election over something that was, speculated Russian influencing in TikTok videos. Just astonishing to me. But give me your take on this. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. First of all, this guy Georgescu won in the first round of the presidential elections, and it was quite a shock because he was a far right-wing outlier who, but seemingly came from nowhere and to win the first round of presidential elections, to come in the lead, but based on the flimsiest evidence, the Constitutional Court decided this was a Russian influence operation. And their only evidence was that there had been a surge of support on TikTok. And that surge looked like it might be a Russian operation. Looked like might be, doesn't mean anything at all. And evidently, it turns out not to have been a Russian operation. It turns out to have been funded by a local center-right party as part of a very complicated, very Byzantine kind of, pre-election maneuver where they wanted to knock out one candidate and therefore ended up driving up support for another candidate. But the point is that it just goes to show how immense pressure is coming to bear on these countries like Hungary, Slovakia, Georgia, Romania, Moldova to fall into line behind NATO policy with regard to the Ukraine war. The pressures are enormous. These are small countries. Romania has only a population of 19 million people. It's economically troubled. Its finances are really in bad shape. It's really rocky in economic terms, and huge pressures are coming down on them to fall into line to toe the NATO line with regard to the war in Ukraine. Even though the war in the Ukraine is being lost, even though the Ukrainian forces are falling back against the Russian onslaught, and the situation there in purely military terms looks disastrous. So rather than giving up and going home, they're doing the opposite. NATO is putting pressure on all these countries which don't want to be part of this mess, is putting pressure on them to fall in line. And NATO at this point is building a military base in Romania, which will be one of the largest military installations in all of Europe. And it is being built as a frontline anti-Russian military installation. So the Romanians don't want to be dragged into this war. And the fact that the power structure, the Constitutional Court, would use a flimsy excuse in order to cancel elections because they were a pro-Russian candidate or a seemingly pro-Russian candidate was leading is just absolutely shocking. And it's very similar to we've seen here in the U.S.
Mhm.
You know, where the fact that Trump may have sort of kind of leaned towards Russia threw the entire establishment in a panic starting in 2016, and led to years of turmoil, a whole phony destabilization campaign based on the theme of Russian interference. And politics were completely upended. And the result now is 8 years later is that we have Donald Trump preparing to enter the White House. And in Romania, the upshot will likely be a surge for the far right. So the center right parties have wound up undermining their own position. And have only succeeded in strengthening the radical right. It's a complete debacle.
I mean, do you think this is groupthink, or do you think they're being pressured in some way? Like, do you think pressure is being exerted?
Romania or the EU?
Well, both. I mean, from the standpoint of in Romania, I'm sorry, in Romania itself. I mean, because it's very weird for the court, like you point out. There's no evidence for this. This is the flimsiest of information that came out, and I don't even think you can call it information, considering it was just wrong.
Yeah, I think the pressures are enormous, absolutely enormous.
I guess I'm saying, who are the pressures coming from? Is it from this idea of a group think, or do you think pressure is coming from the EU in some mechanism, in some manner, in order to push these guys?
EU, NATO, and US.
Yeah,
the unholy trinity. I mean, they are putting enormous pressure on this one small and not terribly strong country to fall into line, and it's really hard to resist because those forces, those economic and political and military forces, are immense compared to a Romania, and so therefore Romania is buckling under the strain. But as it buckles, its politics are splintering, and that actually is really bad news for Romanian democracy. Mm-hmm. So it's a really bad situation, and the U.S. and NATO are really overplaying their hands, and as a consequence, they're losing a war in the Ukraine, and they're going to be losing a democracy in Romania.
Do you think the same thing is true in Georgia? I mean, the prime minister up to this point has been able to maintain has been able to hold his shape against just overwhelming pressure in trying to overthrow that government. And the president, Shalom Zorbaishvili, she kept saying, I'm not leaving, but it sounds like she will be leaving, regardless of what she wanted, even though she's screaming for new elections to be held. There's a weird phenomenon in Europe where they want to just keep having elections until they get the result that they want. Yeah. That's not really democracy. That's something else. But do you think, I mean, the same thing is going to be true in Georgia, where they're overplaying their hand, that ultimately they're not going to get what they want in this situation?
I think they won't get what they want. I think you're quite correct. I think that NATO is overplaying its hand, and its strategy is backfiring. I mean, Georgia is even more extreme case. I mean, Georgia is next door to Russia. And therefore, as a small country of only 3.7 million people, it's got to keep an eye on its big neighbor. This is a fact of life. This is whether you live in Belgium and right next to France, or you live in Ireland next to Britain, or Canada next to the U.S. You've got to keep, or Hong Kong next to China. You've got to keep an eye on your neighbor. Your options are limited. And Georgia wants to maintain good relations with Russia. And it doesn't want to jump on a sinking ship, which is the war in the Ukraine being pushed by NATO. So as a result, pro-NATO forces have staged 3 weeks of nightly riots in Tbilisi, the capital city. Even though the pro-NATO forces lost an election, and there's little question that they lost. There's little question that the ruling party, the Georgian Dream Party, won, and there's little question that Georgians, the Georgian population in general, doesn't like being pushed around by these NATO rent-a-mobs. And the thing is, the NGO sector, the non-governmental organizations sector in Georgia, for various historical reasons, is just immense. They have completely distorted the local economy and local politics because they pay salaries that are 3 or 4 times what non-NGO sectors pay. They are the employer of choice for all young college graduates. And therefore, they have been ideologically very forceful in shaping the opinions of those young college graduates. So they are pushing this pro-NATO line, which the bulk of the Georgian population doesn't want. So we're seeing this all over, and we're seeing a growing revolt against these kinds of neoliberal policies, which are clearly failing, clearly collapsing.
Can we go to Germany also while we think about this? The Christmas market massacre, where a Saudi man apparently drives his car into a Christmas market. I mean, Americans may not know this, but they have Christmas markets all across Europe. It's not just in Germany. I went to one. I think it was in like Croatia or somewhere like that. They're great places, but they're huge numbers of people that typically be at these things. Apparently 200 people were injured. I believe it was 4 or 5 people that were killed, including a child. And the Saudi man, the Saudis had apparently petitioned to get him deported back to Saudi Arabia. Germany wouldn't do it because they thought he would be executed. And you got the AFP who was saying, we would have sent him, meaning we would have exported him. We would have kicked him out of the country when Saudi Arabia asked. Is this going to be damaging to the current government in the upcoming election, where basically this is going to fall within the immigration policies, and the AFP is going to basically point out and say that massacre happened because of the way Germany and this Schultz government has done and conducted themselves around the issue of immigration? Is this going to damage the Schultz government in the upcoming election?
Oh, I think it definitely will. There's no question it will. What's odd is the Saudi individuals' politics seem to have been not Islamist but anti-Islamist, strangely enough, so it's all rather confused, and no one quite knows what to make of it. But yeah, there's little doubt that this kind of horrible violence, horrible terrorism by a Muslim immigrant will not go down well with the German population, and will certainly harm the Social Democrats, the major party, and will benefit the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland. But these kind of politics being played out all across Europe. I mean, as the economic stresses increase, as the military situation turns negative in the Ukraine, as the horrors in the Middle East multiply, there is just a great deal of anger and insecurity about where all this is going, where the ruling parties seem to be steering the whole region in the wrong direction, and increasingly for the benefit of a smaller and smaller economic elite. So people are upset. The same thing in the U.S., by the way. I mean, it's no different. And the liberals have discredited themselves through their completely bankrupt political policies, and so there's a surge for the right. Now Donald Trump suddenly is the hero of the day. That's not a good thing as far as I'm concerned, but it is definitely the what you could expect from these years of really misbegotten policies.
No, I agree with you. I didn't vote for Trump. Do not like him any stretch of the imagination. I mean, there's certain things that I guess I appreciate about him more than liberals. I mean, he's not anti-war by any stretch of the imagination, but he does seem to be open for deals in a way that liberals aren't. I mean, I remember during the election where J.D. Vance was in the debate with Mike Waltz, and Mike Waltz was attacking him for making peace with North Korea. And I remember J.D. Vance turned and was like, look, compromise is not a dirty word. And that's astonishing that a Republican is telling a liberal that compromise is not a dirty word when that is supposed to be this kind of thing of the left, this kind of willingness to compromise and at the very least, ideally, voice anti-war sentiments. That is not the liberal class of today. What do you think happened to liberals? Do you think it was just, I mean, yes, you can go back to, what is his name? You can go back to, not FDR, LBJ. You can go back to LBJ in the Vietnam War, fair enough. But typically, liberals were at the very least vocally less belligerent. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore. It seemed to have been a political flip.
Yeah. To me, it's the great turning point was the 1990s, but certainly the 1991 Persian Gulf War, which that was a long time ago. That was more than 30 years ago, which has happened when Iraq invaded Kuwait after the U.S. ambassador to Iraq gave a very confusing statement to her Iraqi counterparts that seemed to indicate a measure of U.S. support for Iraqi intervention. It was a very bad statement, very vague, very poorly worded. But in any case, Iraq invaded. Then the U.S. put together a coalition that drove Iraq out of Kuwait. But in the congressional vote for the authorization, a majority of Democrats voted against the military authorization. A majority of Democrats. And as you know, the war turned out to be a happy romp for the U.S. and its allies. They drove the Iraqi army out. It was a completely one-sided military operation. And so therefore, amid that victory, the Democrats all decided they had clearly made a big mistake in failing to support this. So the lesson they drew is that we're not going to be out-hawked ever again. So Democrats, therefore, reinvented themselves over the course of the 1990s as a hawkish party. And we saw that in 2001 to 2003. We saw that during the Barack Obama administration, where he brought in Hillary Clinton to run his foreign policy, and she pursued the neocon line straight down the line, and the results were disastrous. Major conflagrations in Syria and Iraq, and the coup d'état in the Ukraine that was spearheaded by U.S.-backed neo-Nazi forces that essentially laid the basis for the start of a full-scale war 8 years later, and now we're living with the results. So that so the Democrats reinvented themselves as a hawkish party, and so the remarkable thing, therefore, is that Donald Trump now looks like a peacenik. He now looks like a guy who seems reasonable, who wants to avoid military conflict and reach a compromise whenever possible. And the Democrats are shocked. I mean, my God, how can anybody talk about compromise? How can anybody, not go in with guns blazing? So there's been a remarkable reversal where the hawkish party is now, in certain respects, the more dovish party, and the doves are now the hawks.
You said the liberals basically debased themselves. They discredited themselves. And I would say the same thing is true in Europe, by the way. When I was there to cover the European elections, and it was very clear that liberals were going to lose, not just where I was in Austria, but all throughout Europe. And despite the fact that many of them lost, like the Greens and all these other groups, many of these people lost their seats, they kept the same policy. Von der Leyen ends up getting reelected again. They blow off the results of the election and they just keep going in the same direction with this notion of pro-war. And I guess in the United States, I think the same thing is also true. I mean, do you see any, I guess what the word I'm looking for, any contrition, any recognition that they got it wrong? I think I heard you say no. You just double.
I just see them doubling down. Not at all. I mean, do you see anything like this coming out of Joe Biden's mouth? I mean,
No.
Joe Biden still sees the Ukraine war as a holy crusade, and as the events in Romania show, the attempt to vilify Putin, to demonize Putin, to paint him as the author of every of everything evil in the entire world. If a child falls down and scrapes his knee, it's got to be, Putin's got to be at the bottom of it. And it's absolutely just, extraordinary. And I've seen no contrition, no analysis, no second thoughts about this policy. And in the Middle East, of course, the U.S. is completely tagged behind Israel, has never once questioned what Israel is doing, and now it looks like it is once again trying to resurrect the old Abraham Accords, which, by the way, go back to Trump, which would essentially the U.S. would pledge to defend Saudi Arabia against Iran in return for Saudi financial support for a puppet government in Gaza and the West Bank. And that U.S. protection for Saudi Arabia, what that really means is a policy of stepped up hostility to Iran. So the U.S. is pursuing the same bellicose policy in the Middle East. And I see no second thinking thoughts about that whatsoever. And by the way, I think that Trump will essentially pursue the same policy, the same pro-Saudi policy, an anti-Iranian policy. It's not clear what he's going to do in Syria, what he's going to do with the Kurds, because that's a really ticklish situation. But my sense is he'll probably sell them out in an attempt to reach an accord with Turkey. But Trump is worse in the Middle East. He's perhaps better in the Ukraine, but it's really the same old imperialist.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. So al-Jolani has changed his name to
al-Shara.
To al-Shara. He's trying to distance himself from the head chopping thing. And in doing so, though, one of the things he pointed out in a meeting with the Turkish Foreign Minister, Fidan, I believe his name is, he said that he's going to disarm all of the groups, basically all armed groups that are in Syria are going to be disarmed and it's going to fall under the auspices of the military. And he said even the Kurds, basically, yes, we are also going to disarm them. And of course, he's been doing that by taking their lives and taking their territory up to this point. Nothing that Blinken has said has stopped or slowed them down. They have continued their onslaught of the Kurds. What do you think? I mean, I agree with you on that. My first thought was, okay, well, the U.S. is not going to be able to stop him. Or maybe, I guess my first thought was, will the U.S. attack Turkish-backed rebels who have just taken the government of Syria at this point? Especially with the U.S. saying that now they have double the amount of troops in Syria than they believed before. Are these things related to one another? Meaning, are these stories connected? That, yeah, we have 2,000 troops in Syria now. Oh, and by the way, al-Jolani is continuing to go after the Kurdish groups that we back and that the Turks call terrorists. Like, this is a mess, to put it mildly. I mean, give me your take on that. I mean, for one, do you think he's even going to be able to do that? Are the groups going to volunteer their weapons, give up their weapons in order to join the Syrian military? And why do you think he's doing that?
Well, I don't think that the Kurdish forces will give their weapons up. They've been battling HTS for years, and I don't think they're going to lay their weapons down now. I think that the fighting will continue. I think the situation in Syria will deteriorate. Al-Jolani is now in the honeymoon phase of his revolution. But we've seen this before 1,000 times. There's the honeymoon phase, lasts a few weeks. Everybody's very happy and lovey-dovey, et cetera, and then the knives come out. the fighting starts. So he's al-Jolani, al-Shara, whatever he's calling himself these days. He's in the lull before the storm. And meanwhile, the Kurds will not lay down their arms. They are very experienced, very effective fighters, very well armed. They are a formidable force. And meanwhile, there are thousands of ISIS members who are being in a prison camp guarded by the Kurdish forces. And if the Kurdish forces are essentially, if their attention is drawn elsewhere, or if they're beaten, that means that ISIS, thousands of ISIS fighters are released and ready to join the fray. And there's little doubt those ISIS fighters will essentially join forces with HTS, because HTS has tons of ISIS Jolani himself is a former ISIS fighter.
Yes, he is.
So I think that if the Kurds are defeated, the result will be a union of these two wings of the ISIS movement, a revitalized al-Qaeda guerrilla force, and therefore renewed turmoil in the rest of Syria, because the Syrians don't want to be governed by al-Qaeda. I don't think anybody does, but certainly an advanced society, advanced multi-ethnic, multi-religious society like Syria does not want to be governed by these head choppers. And that's what they are, by the way. They are head choppers. There is no question about it. I mean, this war, the U.S. has sponsored this insurgency, this anti-government movement for 12 or 13 years at this point, and they finally succeeded in ousting Assad. The American press is jubilant, and Assad's got a lot to answer for, but nonetheless, this is clearly a NATO-backed takeover, and it's going to lead to chaos.
Yeah, I mean, I unfortunately, I strongly suspect you're right. I mean, I have a hard time believing those groups are going to willfully disarm. I mean, even groups that are part of HTS. Now, the Turkish foreign minister pointed out that that Jolani is ready to form a government, that the sanctions need to be removed, and that they can take over guarding the terrorists. So effectively saying, hey, we can trust these guys to guard the ISIS fighters that are in the prisons. We should have no issue with that. Everything will go fine. We don't need the Kurds to do that job anymore. I mean, do you accept that? I mean, this seems to be fanciful to me. Dude was clearly part of ISIS. I mean, in fact, some of the reporters that were on the ground, the people will still have the black badges on while they were on the ground talking to the press. And so it's like, do we really believe that this handover will take place this casually? And why is Turkey so okay with this? I mean, granted, I know they have a certain amount of control in regards to HTS, but these are ISIS fighters. I mean, are these fighters also backed by Turkey in the way that they're in their mindset?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, Turkey. Erdogan is essentially a Muslim Brotherhood supporter. He's like, no, the Muslim Brotherhood is a broad coalition, and it contains certain quasi-liberal elements and certain arch-conservative elements. On the whole, the movement is extremely conservative, if not actually fascist. And Erdogan is an MB supporter. So therefore, and the Muslim Brotherhood was on the side of al-Qaeda and ISIS during this Syrian civil war. So these are all Sunni fundamentalist forces that are in broad ideological agreement, and they want a Sharia state. And even though Syria does not want a Sharia state. So this is going to be a source of turmoil. The story there is just beginning. There's going to be a lot more going on. The repercussions will go on and on for a long time. But meanwhile, the Turks, the heirs to the old Ottoman Empire are now recolonizing the Middle East, the Arab Middle East, and Syria has finally fallen to Turkish control. It's really pretty extraordinary.
Wow. Yeah. Look, everybody that I brought on the show to talk about it was just shocked. I mean, just fully shocked. I mean, couldn't not wrap their head around how the government fell so quickly. But
well, the New York Times had an interesting article a couple of days ago about the final days of Assad, and it quoted an official, an anonymous official in the Iranian National Revolutionary Guard, informing his superiors that look, it's over. The Syrians just can't fight another war. In other words, after 12 or 13 years of brutal warfare, they're exhausted, and they lost because essentially NATO's resources are greater than Syria's. That's what happens. But it's a very bad outcome. I mean, first of all, Erdogan is a member of NATO, and so therefore NATO is colonizing the Middle East directly. Yeah. And this is a devastatingly bad outcome.
One last question: the Arab states, what are they thinking right now? I mean, because you're right, Erdogan is effectively just taking a country, an Arab country, no less. I mean, what are they thinking? What is in their mindsets? I mean, are they thinking from their point of view, okay, well, we're safe because we're aligned with the United States? But certainly they know that if they ever get off kilter, that they could also fall prey to the same tactics that were used against Syria, or they don't think that could ever happen to them.
Well, when you talk about the Arab states, that this is a incredibly, disparate group, even more than the European states or even the Latin American states. I mean, you have these oil states, such as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, etc., that are fabulously wealthy and fabulously reactionary. I mean, they are slave states essentially. Then you have countries like Egypt that are enormously populous but are in absolutely desperate economic shape. You have a Jordan, which is doing somewhat better economically, but as politically is showing signs of instability. You have Iraq, which is a U.S. protectorate, and then you have Lebanon, which is completely, utterly bankrupt, dysfunctional. So the entire region has just been devastated. I suppose you could, obviously, Islam bears some responsibility for this, just as say Roman Catholicism bore some responsibility for centuries of backwardness in Latin America. But it really is the politics of oil. I mean, these extractivist economics and politics just create devastation. Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, wherever oil is, you see corruption, fantastic levels of profiteering, political breakdown, and colonization. And that is the story in the Middle East. And so they are essentially paying, their societies are paying an enormous price in order to feed the industrial world's oil addiction.
Wow. I really do appreciate it. I'm going to say Merry Christmas, Daniel Lazar. He's an independent journalist and author, best known as a critic of the U.S. Constitution, American politics, and government and social policy in general. He's written several books, including The Velvet Coup, America's Undeclared War, and many others. You can follow Daniel on X at DHLazar, and you can find his column on weeklyworker.co.uk and many more. Daniel, man, thank you for this. I always appreciate your analysis on this, and we have a really good crowd here today, so I'm pretty sure they appreciate it too. I appreciate it. Merry Christmas, man.
Merry Christmas.
You have a good one.
Same to you.
All right, guys. We have come to nearly the end of the show. I want to read the chats before I bail out. I do not know if I'm going to be here tomorrow just because we are getting close to Christmas Eve, and typically we take those days off when the radio show. So I think I may do the same thing here. It says, now as Bernie Griff is all dried up, Jink and Anna are going back to their name on the right. So many of you may not know this, but President Jafar, you're perfectly right. Jink used to be a Republican. So in the old days when he used to do, public access TV, I believe, he used to be a right winger. And somewhere along the way, I think it was the Iraq War, where there was this kind of transmutation into a populist lefty. It was just kind of this, I don't know, this growth, this evolution, if you want to call it that. It's not that but to be honest, I don't get the sense that he is going back to his roots as a Republican. I think it's like Carville thing. Do you remember, like after the election, when Democrats lost, you had many of the Democrats who came out and was like, well, her campaign was flawless. She even had Queen Latifah, and Queen Latifah don't do campaigns. I mean, you had all of this kind of nonsense that was going on. Everybody is racist and sexist and bigoted, and black men are racist and sexist, and Hispanic men are racist. I mean, it's just all of this nonsense. No self-reflection at all. But you have some people like Carville who has always taken this point of view that the point is to win. That, you know, it's not about losing and maintaining your moral core in that sense, or like losing elegantly. A loss is a loss is a loss. From Carville's point of view, you're supposed to win. That's the entire point of elections. You win in order to get stuff done. And ideally, the things that you get done are also the gateway to you winning more. And so Carville's point of view is like, I don't know what's going on. I'm, feeling my way in the dark to try to figure out what's happening. Because his point of view is, I'm trying to win. I'm trying to build a political coalition to win. And I want to figure out how to do that in this kind of changing climate where the Democratic Party has fundamentally lost the working class and their brand is trash. It's possible that Uyghur is doing something of the same. Like if I give him the best look on this, I don't think most Americans are entirely ideologically wed in the way that many liberals are. So if you look at a Sam Cedar or Emma Vigeland, these people are in a cult and they're acting like they're in a cult. And so the very notion that you would take a policy or two that is somewhat different than the rest of your cult, okay, well, they freak out. Oh my God, I can't believe Uyghur is doing this. He's working with the racists. And it's like, okay, you guys are being hyperbolic. Is he really working with the racists? It's like, has he really changed his economic policy? Okay, well, the answer is no. Has he really changed policy on war? Okay, well, I think they're convoluted on that issue. But my point is, they retain this kind of economic populism with this notion of we need to build a coalition to beat back the establishment. And if there are Republicans that are willing to do that and would agree with an economic argument, even though they still may be somewhat more Republican, then we are okay with fighting on the realms and the things to which we agree. So you will get Turkish-backed rebels working with US-backed rebels, basically Turkish-backed terrorists working with US-backed terrorists in order to take down Syria. The moment that Syria falls, okay, now we're at disagreements again. Because now you have one group that is backed by the US, another group that's backed by Turkey, and the group backed by Turkey is killing the group that is backed by the US. Everybody was on the same page up until the point where they won. And I guess they're thinking something similar. Okay, how do you build a coalition in order to get people, marshal people to your cause? And if the way you're going about it is alienating the voter base, then how do you do it in a way that doesn't alienate the voter base? Now, it's also true that because of the way politics goes, if you identify a person as a Democrat, identify them as a Republican, you trust them less. Meaning the things that are coming out of their mouth, you trust them and regard it less because there's a hurdle that the people have to get to, a cognitive hurdle that they have to get to just to hear what you're saying and to put that within a context that is not taken with a certain degree of suspicion. Okay, so if you all of a sudden come on and say, you know what, we have to do this better. We want to get a coalition. We want to win. How do we get this coalition? How do we win in this particular climate? And you start thinking to yourself, okay, well, what are the policies that we do that are unpopular versus what are the things that we do that are popular? And all those things that we really need to die on this kind of vine of ideological purity on. Well, you can come to a conclusion of saying, no, if our objective is to win, and the things that are more important are these kind of populist policies to us, and the thing that's standing in the way of getting any of that stuff done is the establishment, then we need to go after the establishment, whether that's a Democrat or a Republican, meaning as an ally that will help us do that. Now, the rubber is always going to meet the road on this notion of who you're going to vote for, because that's going to be somewhat of a binary choice. But either way, I don't necessarily see the Young Turks ever turning around and say we're going to vote for this Republican in order to stick it to the Democrats as an establishment. No, which is, again, where the rubber is going to ultimately meet the road. But if you are a media outlet and you are putting out something where the public will say, you know what, I can agree with the economic stuff, but I don't like the transgender surgeries. And so you may accept one part. I hope that makes sense, right? Like, meaning it may allow them to get their foot in the door in a way where they believe they can win the argument on other issues, bring more people into the camp. I think that's what they may be thinking. I don't necessarily think it's a grift in their sense. I think they may be having a come to Jesus moment. I could be wrong. Who knows? It could totally be a grift. But I don't get the sense that they're moving back to the right. I get the sense that they're trying to figure out their footing in this kind of new reality where the Democratic Party has been fundamentally alienated. And certain of those policies, especially policies that they conflate with progressivism. I mean, when they talk about like transgender bathrooms, for example, or kids having surgeries, or men playing in women's sports, those type of things. Well, those things alienate the rest of the public that don't agree with those things. And so if you're doing with this notion of this kind of ideological purity on those issues, you will lose support. Now, if you are not ideologically pure on these issues and you accept, okay, the American public is going to have a different point of view on this. If, for example, I remember on immigration, I used to say to myself, okay, the American public disagrees with me on immigration. I can accept that. It just is what it is, what it is. The public is not going to agree with you on every particular issue. And, you know, depending upon how ideologically wed you are to those issues is going to make a determination on whether or not you're going to get those people or not. And I'm saying from Uyghur's point of view, especially considering he ran in politics at one point, he's trying to grow a network and he wants that network to continue growing. He's looking at the political space and he may be maneuvering in the political space. It could be a legitimate move or it could be a grift. No idea which one it is. No idea which one. But I don't think it's insane to try to figure out, okay, how do we get a political coalition? And how do we get our foot in the door where we can make the argument to people who may not necessarily be entirely on our current political spectrum, but may be willing to join into this political spectrum? I don't think that's insane at all. But we'll see. I don't know the reality of it. President Jafar, Russia pulling out of Syria was a pragmatic move to avoid conflict, yes, with Turkey, who both share the Black Sea. Syria was a casualty, unfortunately. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I don't think they necessarily wanted to leave Syria. I mean, if you think about the amount of blood and treasure that they put into that country, I would imagine it was a sore moment to have to pick up and leave. But yeah, it's pragmatic. I mean, you know, regardless of what you want, you don't necessarily want your forces to be at the behest of Erdogan, who takes every opportunity of leverage to get something out of it. Yeah, I would imagine that's not necessarily the most safest thing in the world. That meeting in Doha, I strongly suspect, was this kind of acknowledgement that A, this is over, and B, making some kind of agreement on what was going to take place after. So, I mean, I think one of the telltale signs was Russia ending the grain deal. Russia was giving grain. Iran was apparently giving oil and gas, or basically energy, to Syria. Both of those have stopped. Both of those have stopped. So they will be dependent upon sanction relief. That's assuming they even get the sanction relief. Thank you, President Jafar. Natalie Williams. Thank you, Natalie Williams. Really appreciate your varied point of view you present, Jamal. May you and yours enjoy the holiday. Ah, thank you. I appreciate it. I don't have a political dog in this hunt. I'm in the political wilderness in this country. When you don't have a dog in the hunt, sitting on the world, perched at the edge of the world looking at events, just giving your take. And yeah, I have political wants. I mean, obviously, I hate this notion of war. I think it's expensive, not to mention getting a lot of people killed is radically immoral, especially for the reasons we do it, which is just this kind of geopolitical expansion. It's still playing this game of kings where the world is a chessboard. I mean, you can see that stuff if you go back, like looking at the Napoleonic Wars, for example, or even before the Napoleonic Wars. It would be like, okay, I'm stronger, so I'm just going to take your territory unless you give me fealty and allegiance. And you get these shifting allegiances where countries get stronger, weaker, have wars and everything else. And it's like, God, man, this is prehistory. Like we're still doing the same shit that we were doing thousands of years ago. Only now we have nukes. And at some point, society is going to have to grow up. Otherwise, we're going to end society. I mean, at some point, there's going to be a mistake. At some point, there's going to be a misprediction. Somebody may just be a lunatic that forces people into conflict. The reality of it is, if you keep pushing, the other person doesn't have a choice but to respond to the fact that you're pushing. Meaning, you can edge us into a war purely on the basis of brinksmanship, where at that point, escalatory, policy just kind of take over on its own, or the politics takes over. It's absurd. The North Korea thing is proof of concept that you can extend a hand to a country and they can extend a hand back, and you take one step after the next with this notion of improving relations. It doesn't have to be war. War is a choice that we choose. I know, what is his name? Mearsheimer. Mearsheimer has this idea that countries logically fight for domination, because if you don't dominate, then you could potentially be dominated. Okay, again, that's a choice. It doesn't have to be that way. You can also choose cooperation. Cooperation can get you further than just this kind of independent solidarity, etc. I mean, think of anything that's built requires a lot of people in order to build it. If you build a society, that takes more than one person. If you build a building, that takes more than one person. If you build a civilization, it takes more than one person. Meaning, you can build far more complicated things the more people that are joining in regards to a shared purpose and a shared goal. And I get that it is easy to create chaos and to kind of drive people apart. By the same token, you get more out of being able to cooperate. The new evolution of the human species, and maybe it's not even an evolution, it's just a new leap, a cultural jump, is to get beyond this nonsense. And I don't know if the multipolar world is us getting beyond that nonsense. I don't know. It seems to be a better alternative as opposed to running around the globe setting fires to everything in order to maintain control, because that seems to be our pathway to maintain control, to blow stuff up, set fires, overthrow governments. Chaos is the plan. I'm saying that needs to stop. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's just, this can be a frustrating job. That's all. This can be a frustrating job. We are taught things when we were kids about respecting life, about being honest, or at the very least trying to be honest, about being ethical, moral, about treating people decently, all that stuff. And then when you get older, you realize it's not really true, especially from a foreign policy sense. It's only true kind of amongst your own. And even in the context of being amongst your own, it's not exactly true, even in that sense, especially when you talk about the rich versus the poor, this kind of class divide. They speak in the language as if we're together in this stuff, but the way it's been act, not so much. I mean, if you have somebody living on the street, obviously the guy who's living on the street is not necessarily in it with you, because they're, after all, on the street. They didn't necessarily participate in this kind of governing thing. I guess my point of view is the world doesn't necessarily have to be this way. And I don't mean this in a comic book utopian view of the world. I mean, I get it. There are pressures that produce the current world that we have at our disposal. A lot of the stuff is based on survival. A lot of the stuff is based on issues of dominance, control, all that stuff. Fair enough. I accept it. We're either going to move past it or this experiment of humanity is going to end. One or the other. My hope is we move past it. So I'm going to end this. I'm going to wish all of you a Merry, Merry Christmas. If I don't see you tomorrow, I'm still probably going to do individual segments if I don't necessarily do the full show tomorrow. So nobody took me off air if you don't see me. Ideally, I didn't drop dead or anything like that. I'm just taking the day. You guys have a phenomenal day, man. And you guys have a Merry Christmas. And I will see you shortly. And I want to thank all of you. If you guys dig the content, give the video a like, share the content, subscribe to this channel. I'm trying to reach 40K by the end of the year. It seems to be a difficult lift, but we're close. We're very close. Nevertheless, definitely give it a like. Hit the contact, or what do they call it? The emergency contact, not emergency contact. Hit the notification bell. I do shows at all times of the day and night, especially when I can't necessarily sleep. Real men do the news when real men can't sleep. So there's that. If you really dig the content, please consider becoming a member, or for that matter, giving through PayPal, Patreon, Super Chat. All stickers, chats will be read, providing you're not sexist, racist, or bigot. That's my spiel. You guys have a phenomenal day. All right. I will see you later today or tomorrow. Signing off.